The sound is not what you think it is. It's not the clean, ringing shing of steel you hear in the movies. It's not a graceful whistle through the air. The sound of the first true weapon is something far more intimate, more brutal. It's the splintering of a wooden shield, the wet, percussive thud of a stone axe crushing bone, the desperate, ragged gasp for air from a man with a flint-tipped spear in his chest. For thousands of years, this was the sound of organized violence. It was close, personal, and exhausting. The weapons were tools repurposed for slaughter: a woodcutter's axe, a hunter's spear, a sharpened stone for skinning an animal. They were extensions of the hand, born from the needs of survival. But then, something changed. Deep in the heat of a furnace, in the minds of the first metallurgists, a new idea began to glow. An idea not for building, or for hunting, or for farming. An idea forged for a single, terrifying purpose. This is welcome to the dark historian. Get comfortable. Dim the lights. Slow your breathing. Let the world outside fade away. There are no screens here. No distractions. There is only the story and the quiet dark. We are going back to a time before history was written down. A time of myth and muscle, where a new kind of fear was about to be cast in metal. We are going to witness the birth of the blade. To understand the sword, you first have to understand the world without it. Imagine a landscape of wood, stone, and bone. Your tribe is going to war. You gather your strength, your courage. What do you hold in your hand? Perhaps a heavy club, a gnarled piece of oak that can shatter a kneecap. Or a stone axe, its head painstakingly napped and lashed to a wooden handle. It's heavy. It's clumsy. To use it effectively, you have to get dangerously close to your enemy, into the realm of kicking, grappling, and biting. Your most advanced weapon is the spear. It gives you reach, a precious few feet of distance from the man trying to kill you. But it is a single-use weapon in a chaotic melee. You throw it, or you thrust it once. And then what? You are back to your axe, your club, your bare hands. Conflict was a thing of brute force. A chaotic, shoving match of bodies where the strongest and most durable man often won. It was a terrifying, intimate affair. You could smell your enemy's sweat, see the panic in his eyes, feel his warm blood on your skin. The wounds were gruesome, crushing injuries, skulls caved in, limbs mangled. It was butchery. Then came the age of metal. First copper, soft and beautiful, good for ornaments and small knives, but too weak to hold a long edge. It bent too easily. It was a step, but not the leap. The leap came when some forgotten genius, some ancient alchemist, discovered a secret. By adding a small amount of another metal tin to the molten copper, something new was created. Something harder, stronger, more resilient. Bronze. The world would never be the same. At first, the applications were familiar. Bronze axe heads that didn't shatter, bronze spear points that didn't chip, bronze daggers, and this is where the story truly begins. With the dagger, a personal weapon for a final, desperate struggle. But in the hands of chieftains and wealthy warriors, these daggers began to grow. Why? Status. A bronze dagger was a sign of immense wealth and power. To own one meant you controlled the resources, the trade routes for copper and tin, and the skilled artisans who could work the metal. So, a powerful leader would want a more impressive dagger than his rival. A little longer, a little more ornate. The daggers stretched from 6 inches to 8 to a foot. They became less like knives and more like something else entirely. And then, one day, a craftsman pulled a blade from a clay mold that was different. It was over 2 feet long. It was too long to be a dagger. It was too thin and slender to be an axe. It had no purpose as a tool for farming or building. It was designed for only one job: to be a more efficient way for one human being to kill another. The first sword was born. Imagine seeing it for the first time. You are a warrior of the old world, armed with your trusty stone axe. You stand in a line of shields, your heart pounding. Across the field, the enemy approaches, and you see it. The sun glints off something you've never seen before. A long leaf-shaped sliver of golden-brown metal in the hand of the enemy chieftain. It seems to glow with its own internal light. It's longer than his arm. He holds it with an ease that is unnerving. Your axe requires a huge, powerful swing. Your spear is good for one thrust. This is something else. It moves like a serpent, a flash of light. It represents a technology so far, beyond your understanding it might as well be magic. This is the first shock of the sword. It is not just a weapon. It is a psychological tool. It instills terror before it ever draws blood. It is a clear and undeniable message: we are the future. You are the past. We have the power to create this object of terrible beauty. You do not. The battle is already half lost in your mind. The first bronze swords were not the elegant weapons of fantasy. They were thick, heavy, and often poorly balanced. Bronze, even good bronze, is a relatively soft metal compared to iron or steel. If you swung it hard against a shield or another bronze blade, it could bend, it could warp. It would not hold a razor edge for long. Because of this, the first swords were primarily stabbing weapons. Look at the designs of the earliest blades from Minoan Crete or Mycenaean Greece. They swell out in the middle, like a leaf, and then taper to a wicked point. This design, the leaf blade, puts weight and strength behind the tip. It's not for fencing or elegant slashing. It's for the thrust. The fighting style was brutal and direct. A warrior would hide behind a large shield and use the sword as a kind of long-range punch. A quick, powerful jab from behind cover, aimed at the face, the throat, the groin. Any exposed part of the enemy. The goal was to bypass his shield and puncture something vital. Combat became a gruesome, exhausting rhythm. Advance, shield up. Jab, retreat, jab. It was a meat grinder. The wounds were horrific. A wide bronze blade didn't make a clean cut. It tore through flesh and muscle, leaving devastating, gaping wounds that were almost impossible to treat. The sword changed the very geometry of the battlefield. With an axe or a club, you had to be within arm's length. With a sword, you suddenly had a bubble of death around you that extended 2 to 3 feet further. This new concept of reach was revolutionary. It allowed a skilled swordsman to keep an opponent with a shorter weapon at bay, jabbing and poking, wearing him down, waiting for an opening. It also introduced a new kind of terror, the fear of being bled out. A crushing blow from a club might break your arm, but you could survive. A deep puncture wound from a bronze sword in your thigh or stomach was a death sentence in an age without modern medicine. You would simply lie on the battlefield and bleed to death, watching your life drain into the dirt. The creation of these weapons was a monumental undertaking. It required a society to be organized in a new way. You needed miners to dig the copper and tin ore from the earth. You needed traders to transport these materials, sometimes over hundreds of miles. You needed vast amounts of charcoal for the furnaces, which meant you needed woodcutters clearing forests. And at the center of it all, you needed the smith. The bronze smith was not just a craftsman. He was a magician, a keeper of secrets. He understood the temperamental nature of the metals, the precise ratio of tin to copper, the exact temperature for a perfect pour. His workshop, the forge, would have been a place of awe and fear, a dark, hot space filled with the rhythmic hiss of the bellows, the roar of the fire, and the shimmering, dangerous glow of molten metal. Imagine the tension of a sword casting. The smith and his apprentices move with practiced urgency. The crucible of liquid bronze, glowing like a captive sun, is lifted from the furnace. The air crackles with heat. They pour the molten metal into a 2-part clay or stone mold carved in the shape of the blade. They have one chance to get it right. Any mistake, any air bubble, and the sword could have a fatal weakness, a flaw that would cause it to snap in the heat of battle. The life of a warrior, perhaps the fate of the tribe itself, depends on this single moment. Once cooled, the work was far from over. The rough blade was removed from the mold. Then began the long, laborious process of hammering. This was critical. Hammering the bronze compressed the metal, hardening it, making it stronger and better able to hold an edge. It was a process called work hardening. Then came the grinding and polishing, using sand and leather for hours and hours until the dull, cast metal began to gleam, until it shone with a terrifying beauty. This entire process was so resource-intensive that only the elite could afford a sword. It was the ultimate status symbol. Kings, chieftains, and champion warriors were buried with their swords. These weren't just tools of their trade, they were extensions of their very identity, symbols of their power, their wealth, and their right to rule. The sword separated the nobility from the common man who fought with a simple spear. It was the birth of a warrior aristocracy, a class of men defined by their mastery of this new and terrible weapon. As the Bronze Age progressed, sword designs evolved. Smiths learned to create stronger blades, to add a central ridge, called a fuller, to lighten the blade without sacrificing strength. Hilts became more sophisticated, offering better grip and protection for the hand. The leaf blade shape gave way to other designs, each suited for a different style of fighting. But the fundamental truth of the sword remained. It was an accelerator of violence. A tribe with 50 swordsmen could now conquer a tribe of 200 spearmen. It allowed for the creation of larger armies, and with larger armies came larger empires, built on the foundation of this new military technology. The sword became the engine of conquest. Think of the Mycenaeans of ancient Greece, the heroes of the Trojan War. Homer's epics are filled with descriptions of bronze-clad warriors, their swords flashing in the sun. Men like Achilles and Hector were defined by their prowess with the blade. The sword was central to their concept of honor, glory, and a heroic death. To die in battle, sword in hand, was the greatest fate a man could hope for. Or consider the mysterious sea peoples, who ravaged the coastlines of the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC. Their raids contributed to the collapse of mighty empires in Egypt and the Near East. And what was their signature weapon, depicted again and again in Egyptian carvings? A new, straight-bladed sword, superior to the sickle-shaped khopesh used by the pharaoh's armies. It was a technological edge that helped bring an entire age to its knees. The sword was more than just metal. It was an idea. The idea that a man's worth could be measured by his skill in a duel. The idea that disputes could be settled, not by consensus or law, but by single combat. The sword introduced a new, brutal calculus into human affairs. It created a world where might, quite literally, made right. Before we follow the journey of the blade as it is reborn in a stronger, darker metal, if you are finding this story helps you quiet your mind, helps you drift away from the noise of the modern day, consider subscribing to The Dark Historian. It allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten histories. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to the channel. Now, back to the Age of Bronze and the shadow it casts. The psychological impact on the individual warrior cannot be overstated. To be trained with a sword was to be set apart. You learned a new language of movement, a deadly dance of thrust and parry. You learned to read your opponent's body, to anticipate his moves, to find the smallest opening for your blade. It required a coldness of mind, a level of discipline and training that was entirely new. This created a feedback loop. The more effective the sword became, the more resources societies poured into making them and training men to use them. This, in turn, fueled more conflict, more conquest, and a greater demand for swords. It was an arms race. played out over centuries in flickering firelight and the clang of hammer on bronze. It's easy to romanticize this, to see the gleaming blade and think of heroes and legends. But we must strip that away. We must remember the reality. The reality was a young man, perhaps no older than 18, standing in the mud and blood, his arm aching from the weight of his shield and sword. His knuckles are raw. He is exhausted, terrified. The man in front of him is just as scared. There is no soaring music, no grand cause. There is only the desperate, primal need to survive the next 30 seconds. And the sword is the instrument of that survival. It is not a noble thing. It is a tool designed to puncture a lung, to sever an artery, to end a life. Its invention represents a profound shift in human consciousness, a move away from the tool that could be used as a weapon to the weapon that could be used as nothing else. It is the moment humanity began to professionalize and perfect the art of killing its own kind. The bronze blade, in all its terrible glory, represents a loss of innocence. It is the physical manifestation of a new way of thinking about power, about conflict, about what one man is willing to do to another to get what he wants. As the centuries wore on, the secrets of bronze gave way to the secrets of an even more powerful metal. A metal that was harder, held a better edge, and was far more plentiful. The age of heroes in bronze was coming to a close. A new age, a darker and more violent age, was dawning. An age of iron. The bronze sword would be rendered obsolete, a relic of a bygone era, but the idea it represented, the fear it forged, would not fade. It would only be honed, sharpened, and perfected. The long, bloody shadow cast by that first gleaming blade would stretch across all of subsequent human history. It was a promise of what was to come. A promise of kingdoms built and destroyed by the edge of a blade. A promise of duels at dawn, of knights and samurai, of crusades and conquests. The story was just getting started, and it only gets louder from here. For now, just listen to the quiet. Think of that first smith pulling a warm, glowing blade from its mold. He holds it up, feels its weight, its perfect, deadly balance. He does not know what he has truly unleashed upon the world. He sees only a beautiful, powerful object. He cannot see the endless river of blood that will flow from its design, the millions of lives it will alter and end. He cannot know that he has given fear a new shape, a long, sharp, and gleaming edge. And for the first time, humanity had a tool that was not for shaping the world, but for breaking it. And so, the world could be broken. Not with a club, or a stone, or a jagged piece of obsidian, but with a purpose-built length of metal, designed for one reason alone, to unmake a life. But a single sword is just a story, a myth, the weapon of a hero or a villain, a king or a usurper. It is an intensely personal object. It has a name, a legend. It is wielded in a duel, a moment of high drama between two individuals. For a tool to truly break the world, it cannot be special. It must be common. It must be predictable. It must be made by the thousands, and then the tens of thousands. It needs to be not a legend, but a uniform. And for that, you have to go to Rome. You have to imagine a different kind of world. A world where the sword is not a treasure, but a piece of government-issued equipment, like a shovel, or a helmet, or a pair of sandals. It is handed to a man not because he is noble, but because he is a number in a legion. This is where the story of the sword turns from one of personal violence to one of industrial subjugation. This is the story of the gladius. Don't picture a long, elegant blade. Forget the knightly swords of fantasy. The Roman gladius was short, broad, and brutally practical. It was, in essence, a sharpened crowbar, about 2 feet long, with a wide, leaf-shaped blade that tapered to a wickedly sharp point. It wasn't designed for graceful sweeping arcs. You couldn't have a flashy duel with a gladius. It was made for one thing, the thrust, a short, economical, brutal punch of steel. This wasn't an accident. It was the heart of a terrifyingly effective system. The Roman legionary was a walking fortress. In his left hand, the towering shield, the scutum, a curved wall of wood and leather that he could hide behind, locked shoulder to shoulder with the man next to him. And in his right hand, held low, was the gladius. The training was relentless. Day after day, recruits would practice on a wooden post. They were not taught to slash. Slashing, the Roman trainers knew, was dramatic but inefficient. A slash often cut muscle or skin, but rarely killed instantly. It exposed the swordsman's arm and torso. It was messy. It was emotional. The Romans were not interested in emotion. They were interested in results. So they trained the thrust, stab, twist, pull. Over and over, the motion became instinct. From behind the wall of shields, the legionary would make a short, sharp lunge. Not at the head, not at the arms. At the torso, the belly, the groin, the soft places where a few inches of steel could end a life in seconds. There was no poetry to it. It was the cold, calculated geometry of death. Think about the psychology of that. You are not a warrior in a swirling melee. You are a cog in a machine. Your job is not to be a hero. Your job is to hold the line, protect the man to your left, and when the enemy crashes against your shield wall, you execute a simple, practiced motion, a stab, a twist, a pull, and you wait for the next one. The gladius itself reflected this philosophy. They were mass-produced. They were not works of art forged by a master-smith for a great lord. They were made in state-run armories, hammered out by the score. They were simple, strong, and replaceable. If a blade broke, the soldier was issued another. The man was replaceable. The sword was replaceable. Only the legion, the system, was permanent. How does a simple collection of stamped steel and wood become an engine of empire? It becomes the final, bloody punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence written by the Roman state. Imagine you are a tribesman in Gaul, in what we now call France. Your life is one of forests and fields, of small villages and tribal loyalties. Your people have been here for 1,000 years. Your warriors are brave. They are tall and strong, and they fight with a wild courage, wielding long, heavy slashing swords. They paint their bodies and scream their battle cries to the gods. They fight for glory, for honor for their chief. They fight as individuals. And then, one day, you see it on the horizon. It's not an army, not in the way you understand it. It is a thing. A single, unified creature that moves across the landscape, a river of iron and red tunics. You don't hear individual shouts, but a single, rhythmic tramp of thousands of hobnailed sandals on the earth. A sound that shakes the ground. It is the sound of approaching order. The sound of the end of your world. When your warriors charge, they meet not a collection of men, but a wall, a solid barrier of wood and steel. Their long swords clang uselessly against the heavy shields. The wild, individual charges break upon it like waves on a cliff. And from the small gaps in that wall, something flickers out. It's the gladius. It's not a glorious weapon. It doesn't sing through the air. It just appears. A quick, brutal thrust into the gut of the man beside you. He screams, a short, choke sound, and falls. Another thrust, and another man goes down. There is no duel. There is no test of strength. There is only the machine, the meat grinder. Your courage means nothing. Your strength means nothing. The system is all that matters. This is how Rome conquered the world. Not with better heroes, but with a better system. A system where the gladius was the endpoint. The tool that did the final, necessary work. The subjugation of Gaul under Julius Caesar was not a single battle. It was a decade-long process of grinding a people into dust. Town by town, tribe by tribe, the Romans would build their fortified camps, their siege engines, their roads, They would methodically dismantle a culture. And at every step, the gladius was there. It was the tool used to execute captured chieftains. It was the threat that kept rebellious villages in line. It was the weapon that cut down men, women, and children in the brutal sacks of towns that refused to yield. Think of the siege of Alesia, the great climax of the Gallic Wars. Hundreds of thousands of Gauls, united under their charismatic leader Vercingetorix, trapped in a fortress, a massive, desperate gamble to throw the Romans out. And what did Caesar do? He didn't just attack the fortress. He built a fortress around the fortress. 11 miles of walls, ditches, and towers facing inward to keep the Gauls in. And then he built another wall, 14 miles long, facing outward to keep the Gallic relief army out. It was an act of supreme logistical arrogance. And in the trenches, in the mud and the blood between those walls, the final, desperate battles were fought. And they were won by the short sword. In the close, brutal confines of trench warfare, the long, slashing swords of the Gauls were clumsy and useless. But the Roman legionary packed tight could still do his work. A stab, a twist, a pull. When Alesia fell, 1 million Gauls were said to have been killed or enslaved during the entire campaign. An entire culture, broken and remade in the Roman image. The tool for that breaking was the gladius. It was the symbol of a new kind of power, not the power of a king, but the power of a state. An impersonal, relentless, and brutally efficient power. This story was repeated across the known world. In Britain, the Celtic tribes who resisted were pushed back into the hills of Wales and Scotland, their sacred groves cut down, their people put to the sword. In Judea, the great revolt against Roman rule ended with the destruction of Jerusalem. The historian Josephus describes scenes of unimaginable horror. The city starved, the people fighting in the streets, and then the legions breaking through. The temple, the center of the Jewish faith, was burned to the ground. And in the narrow, smoking streets, the work of the gladius was finished. No one was spared. The sword became something more than a weapon. It became the ultimate symbol of Roman authority. When a Roman governor traveled his province, he was preceded by lictors, bodyguards who carried the fasces. A bundle of rods, symbolizing the state's power to scourge, with an axe bound in it, symbolizing the power to execute. But in the provinces, that power was enforced not by an axe, but by the ever-present legions and their short, practical swords. The peace they created, the famous Pax Romana, was a peace born of overwhelming force. It was 2 centuries of relative stability, where trade could flourish and cities could grow, but it was a peace kept under the shadow of the sword. Every non-Roman in the empire knew their place. They knew that if they stepped out of line, the legions would come. The rhythmic marching would sound on their roads, and the wall of shields would form. And the short, ugly, brutally effective little sword would do its work. The gladius was not just a tool for killing soldiers. It was a tool for killing worlds, for ending cultures, for enforcing a new order on conquered peoples. It represented the idea that civilization was not something that grew organically, but something that could be imposed by force. That peace could be achieved through terror. You can see the legacy of this everywhere. In the languages we speak, in the laws we have, in the very layout of our cities. The Roman Empire shaped the Western world. But we often forget the price of that shaping. We forget the sound of the iron-shod sandals on a stone road. We forget the smell of a sacked city. We forget the cold, efficient feel of a mass-produced blade sliding home. It is a chilling thought that the foundation of so much of what we call civilization was laid, not with stones of philosophy and art, but with a simple, stabbing sword held in the hand of an ordinary man, doing his job. He was a farmer from Italy, or a conscript from Spain, or a volunteer from North Africa. He was just a man. But when he picked up that shield and that sword, he became something else. He became a tiny, sharp piece of the Roman state. He became the will of the Senate made flesh and steel. And as the empire grew, the demand for these swords and the men to wield them became insatiable. The machine had to be fed. More iron had to be mined from the hills of Spain. More trees had to be felled for the charcoal to stoke the forges. More men had to be recruited from the very peoples they had just conquered, taught to abandon their old ways, and handed a gladius of their own. They were taught to use it against their own kind, against the barbarians who lived just beyond the new frontiers. The sword, in this way, became a tool of assimilation. To hold a gladius and fight in a legion was a path to Roman citizenship. You could literally kill your way into the civilization that had destroyed your own. You could adopt the identity of your conqueror. You could become part of the machine, and the machine ground on for centuries. The design of the gladius changed slightly over time, becoming longer in the later empire as tactics shifted. But its essential nature remained. It was the weapon of the organized, the disciplined, the state-sponsored professional. It was the answer to the chaos beyond the frontiers. But no empire lasts forever. And when the machine begins to break down, the tools it created take on a new and even darker life. The very swords that had carved out the empire and held its borders would eventually be turned inward. In the endless civil wars of the later Roman period, legion fought against legion. Roman used the gladius against Roman. The tool of imperial conquest became the tool of imperial suicide. The men wielding them were no longer just disciplined soldiers fighting for the abstract idea of Rome. They were fighting for a particular general, a would-be emperor, who promised them land and gold. The sword was no longer a symbol of the state's power, but of a warlord's ambition. The system that had created the weapon was now being torn apart by it. And as the Western Empire crumbled, as the frontiers collapsed and new peoples swept in, the gladius and the legions that wielded it faded into history. But the idea it represented did not. The idea of a professional army, of a mass-produced weapon, of a state-sponsored system of violence designed to impose order. That idea would sleep for a time, but it would never truly go away. The sword had been transformed. From a personal object of myth and honor, it had become an impersonal instrument of policy. It was the scalpel that carved the world to the Senate's liking, and in doing so, it left scars that have never fully healed. It created a legacy of power, of order built on violence, that would echo down through the long, dark centuries to come. The short, ugly sword had shown the world how to build an empire. And it had also shown the world how an empire could bleed. But the bleeding of an empire is not always done on a distant frontier, with clashing shields and the screams of a charge. Sometimes, the most profound bleeding happens at home. In the quiet, watchful heart of the city, it happens in the public square, under a midday sun, not with the chaotic frenzy of battle, but with the cold, deliberate precision of a ritual. The sword, having proven its worth in carving out nations, was about to find a new, more intimate purpose. It was about to become the final word in an argument, the ultimate tool of order, the symbol not of a soldier's strength, but of a king's power. This is welcome to the dark historian. Get comfortable. Dim the lights, slow your breathing. Let the world outside fade away. We are leaving the battlefield behind, its mud and its blood, and we are walking into the unnerving silence of the executioner's stage. The sword in this new role is a different beast entirely. It is not the short, pragmatic gladius of the legionary, nor the long, graceful blade of a cavalryman. Think of the sword you know from the battlefield. It is a weapon of possibility. It can parry, it can thrust, it can slash. It is made for a conversation of violence, a deadly dance where either party might win. The executioner's sword speaks only one word, and it is always the last. These swords were often massive, great, two-handed blades known as Zweihänder in the Germanic lands where they were most famous. But they were oddly designed. Look closely at one in a museum, and you'll see something is missing. A point. The tip is often rounded, blunted, or squared off, because this sword was never meant to be thrust into a gut or a chest. It had no need for such finesse. Its job was not to duel. Its job was to fall. All of its engineering, its incredible weight and balance, was focused on a single downward arc, a journey of polished steel from the sky to the neck. It was in its own way a perfect machine, a guillotine powered by human hands, and the man who held it, he was not a soldier. Soldiers were celebrated, honored. They were heroes. The executioner was something else, a pariah, a necessary monster. In many societies, the executioner and his family were forced to live apart, often in the worst parts of town, near the tanneries or the butcheries. Their touch was considered unclean, their shadow a bad omen. They were often forbidden from entering a church through the main door, and yet they were an official arm of the state, a salaried employee of the crown, or the city, or the church. Imagine the psychology of such a man. To be feared by all, shunned by your neighbors, but to be the one person the king himself relies on to demonstrate his ultimate authority. The executioner was the living embodiment of the state's power over your very life. He didn't make the laws. He didn't pass the judgment. He simply was the consequence, the final, brutal, undeniable full stop at the end of the sentence. His work was not done in the heat of passion. It was a craft, a terrible, precise art form. A bungled execution, one that took multiple swings, was a disaster. It could turn the crowd's fear into pity, and their pity into rage. The mob might turn on the executioner himself, so he had to be skilled. He had to practice, often on animals or corpses, learning the exact amount of force, the perfect angle to sever a human spine in one clean blow. He had to be strong, not just in his arms, but in his will, to stand before a crowd, before a kneeling, praying human being, and bring that terrible weight down without flinching, without a flicker of doubt. This is the sword's new purpose, not to conquer foreign lands, but to conquer the will of the people at home. And you have to ask, why make it so public? Why build a scaffold in the center of town, declare a holiday, and have thousands of people watch a man die? It seems barbaric to us, and it was. But it was not mindless barbarism. It was calculated. It was theater. Place yourself in that crowd. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, of cheap beer and roasted nuts, sold by vendors working the event. Children are perched on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. There's a strange energy, a mix of festive excitement, and a deep, humming dread. You are not there just to see a man die. You are there to be taught a lesson. The man on the scaffold, kneeling in a rough-spun shirt, he has broken the law. He has defied the king. He has questioned the church. And the lesson, taught by the state, is simple. This is what happens to people like him. This could be you. The priest finishes his prayer. The condemned says his last words, often drowned out by the jeers or murmurs of the crowd. Then a silence falls, a heavy, profound quiet. All eyes go to the executioner as he raises the great sword. The sun catches the polished steel, a flash of blinding light. It seems to hang in the air for an eternity, and in that moment of silence, the state is speaking directly to every single person in that square. It is saying, I own this moment. I own the air you breathe. I own the life of this man, and by extension, I own yours. Then, the whistle of the blade cutting through the air, the wet, heavy thud, the gasp from 1,000 throats. The lesson is over. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about reinforcement. Every public execution was a re-swearing of allegiance, a renewal of the social contract written in blood. The crowd, by watching, became participants. They were complicit in the state's power. They went home that day not just thinking about the poor soul who lost his head, but about the power that took it. They walked a little straighter. They spoke a little quieter. The sword, in that moment, was more powerful than an entire army. It had conquered not a piece of land, but a piece of the public's mind. This use of the blade as a tool of psychological control became a dark art, perfected over centuries. It was the weapon of choice for political purges. In ancient Rome, the prescription lists posted in the forum were death sentences carried out by sword. A rival senator, a wealthy merchant whose property you coveted, a general who was a little too popular with the legions. Their names would appear on the list, and soon a blade would find them, in their homes or on the street. The sword became a scalpel for excising political tumors. But perhaps the sword's most terrifying role as an instrument of control came when it was held not in the hand of a king's executioner, but in the hand of God's. Or at least, the hands of those who claimed to serve him, before we follow the sword into the darkened chambers of the Holy Inquisition. A moment. These stories from the past are heavy, and they are meant to be. They are the shadows that help us understand the light. If you are finding this journey into the darker side of history a worthy one, if it helps you to quiet your mind and find rest, consider taking a moment to subscribe to The Dark Historian. It is a small, silent act that allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten tales. Your support is deeply appreciated. Now, let us return to the square, where the line between justice and terror has completely dissolved. The Spanish Inquisition. The very name conjures images of dark rooms, torture devices, and shadowy figures in clerical robes. And at the heart of it all was the idea of purity of faith. The sword was no longer just an enforcer of the king's law, but of God's law. And the crime was no longer just theft or treason. It was thought itself. It was heresy. How do you fight a crime that exists inside someone's mind? You have to make the internal external. You have to make them confess. The entire brutal machinery of the Inquisition, the spies, the interrogations, the torture, it was all aimed at one thing, producing a confession. And once that confession was secured, the heretic's fate was sealed, to be revealed at a grand public ceremony, the auto da fe, the act of faith. And again, we find ourselves in a public square, packed with onlookers. But this time, the ceremony is draped in the awesome, terrifying pageantry of the church. Banners with crucifixes snap in the wind. The air is thick with incense and the chanting of prayers. The condemned are paraded through the streets, wearing sanbenitos, tunics painted with flames and demons to signify their eternal damnation. It is a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses, to blend the power of the state with the absolute authority of the divine. And for those condemned to death, the final act was often carried out by the secular arm. The church, you see, was forbidden from shedding blood, a convenient loophole. So after the priests had passed their sentence, they would hand the heretic over to the state's executioner to do the final, bloody work. The sword, once again, becomes the final word. But this time, it is not just punishing a crime against the king. It is supposedly cleansing a soul for God. It is sending a message not just about earthly power, but about eternal salvation and damnation. Imagine the terror of living in such a time. Your neighbor could accuse you. A business rival could whisper a word in the right ear. A poorly chosen phrase, a book you weren't supposed to own, a lingering attachment to an old faith, any of it, could lead you to that scaffold. The fear was pervasive. It seeped into the walls of every home. The sword didn't even need to be drawn to be effective. Its mere existence, the knowledge of the executioner and his block, was enough to enforce conformity. It was a tool for policing thought, for ensuring that the population not only acted in line, but believed in line. This is the sword at its most insidious, when it is used not to defend a border, but to build a prison of the mind. Think of the contrast. The Roman legionary used his gladius to create an empire of roads, aqueducts, and laws, an external empire. The Inquisitor used the executioner's sword to create an internal empire, an empire of unified belief, maintained by fear. The blade was no longer a tool of expansion, but of compression, forcing everyone into a single, acceptable shape. This model was not unique to the Inquisition. Throughout history, whenever a state or an ideology has sought absolute control, the executioner's sword, or its equivalent, has been there. During the French Revolution, the guillotine, a mechanical sword, fell relentlessly on the necks of enemies of the revolution. In the purges of totalitarian regimes, the firing squad's bullet served the same purpose. The weapon changes, but the principle remains the same. The public, state-sanctioned killing of dissenters is the ultimate tool of social control. The sword in the public square is a declaration. It says that the individual is secondary to the state. Your life is not your own. It is conditional. It is granted to you by the powers that be, and it can be revoked, publicly and brutally, should you step out of line. The weight of that reality presses down on a society. It stifles art, it silences debate, it smothers innovation. It creates a brittle, fearful order, and what of the blade itself? After the act, it would be wiped clean, polished until it shone again, reflecting the sky. It held no memory of the lives it had taken. It was just a tool, steel and wood and leather. But the people who saw it, they remembered. The image of that polished steel arc was seared into their minds. The sword became something more than metal. It became an idea, a symbol of absolute, unquestionable, and terrifying power. It had journeyed from the bloody chaos of the battlefield to the cold, ceremonial precision of the scaffold. It had learned to speak not to armies, but to the private fears of every man and woman in the crowd. It was no longer just a weapon for killing enemies. It was now a tool for ruling subjects. And as it rested in the executioner's chamber, clean and silent, it represented a profound shift in the story of power. The power to create an empire was one thing, but the power to hold it together, to police its every thought and deed from within, that was something else entirely. The sword had proven it could do both. It was the alpha and the omega of statecraft. The tool you used to build your house, and the axe you kept by the door to make sure no one inside ever thought of leaving. The age of the sword as an instrument of pure terror was in full bloom, and its shadow would stretch long across the centuries. But even a shadow this dark can be challenged. And soon the sword would find itself in the hands of new masters, who would attempt to imbue it with a completely different meaning. A code of honor, a vow of chivalry, a knight's sacred duty. The blade was about to get a conscience, or at least the appearance of one. And so, the cold steel of the blade was given a soul, not a true conscience, of course. Not the kind that weighs and measures and feels the sting of regret. No, it was given something far more dangerous. It was given a justification. Imagine a knight kneeling in the cold, echoing nave of a stone cathedral. Sunlight, fractured by stained glass, paints jewels of color on his chainmail. He is a man of violence. He has lived by the sword. His hands are calloused from its grip. His mind is mapped with the brutal calculus of combat. He knows, in the quiet sermons of his youth, that to kill is a sin, a stain. But now a priest stands before him. The air is thick with the scent of old stone, melting wax, and the sweet, heavy perfume of incense. The priest dips his fingers in holy water and anoints the cross guard of the knight's sword. He murmurs prayers in Latin, words that wrap the weapon in a divine mandate. The steel is no longer just a tool for killing. It is now an instrument of God's will, a key to salvation. This single act, repeated in thousands of churches and chapels across Europe, is where the story of the sword takes one of its darkest and most profound turns. This is where the blade becomes holy. How does that change the man holding it? What happens when you are told that the most violent act you can commit is also your most pious, that the path to heaven is paved with the bodies of the unholy? This wasn't just an idea. It was a fire, a fever that swept across a continent. In the year 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II gave a speech. We don't have his exact words, but we know the inferno they ignited. He spoke of a holy city, Jerusalem, in the hands of non-believers. He spoke of desecrated shrines and suffering Christians in the East. And then he made an offer. A revolutionary, terrifying offer. He called upon the knights and lords, the peasants and princes of Christendom, to take up the sword, to march thousands of miles to a land most had only ever heard of in Scripture. And he promised them something no king or emperor could offer: complete remission of all their sins. Think about that, a lifetime of theft, of violence, of lust and greed, all of it washed away, not through prayer or fasting or charity, but through the act of war. The sword was now a tool of penance. Every enemy struck down was a prayer. Every drop of blood spilled was an absolution. The crowd's response was a roar that shook the heavens. A single phrase, repeated over and over, a chant that would become the anthem of an age of slaughter. Deus vult. God wills it. Two simple words, but in them the sword found its ultimate permission. With those words, any atrocity could be justified. Any massacre could be framed as a sacred duty. The blade was no longer a sinner's tool. It was a pilgrim's staff. And so they marched. This was not the clean, orderly campaign you might imagine. For many, it was a chaotic, desperate, sprawling migration of the faithful and the opportunistic. They sewed crosses of red cloth onto their tunics, a stark target on their chests, a symbol of their holy purpose. They were the Cruci Signati, the sign of the cross, the Crusaders. The sword, now sanctified, did not wait for a distant, foreign enemy. Its work began almost immediately, and it began at home. As these armies of the faithful moved through the Rhineland in Germany, they looked upon their neighbors. Jewish communities that had existed for centuries, living peacefully alongside their Christian counterparts. But now, seen through the lens of this new violent piety, they were not neighbors. They were Christ killers. They were infidels right here, within arm's reach. Why travel thousands of miles to fight God's enemies? The preachers asked when they lived just across the river. The logic was simple and brutal. The massacres that followed were a horrific prelude to what was to come. In cities like Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, the swords that had been blessed in cathedrals were drawn against unarmed men, women, and children. Synagogues were burned with people still inside. Families were given a choice baptism or death. Many chose death, taking their own lives rather than submitting to the sword of the mob. The Crusaders, their blades still wet with the blood of their neighbors, wrote home. They wrote of it as a righteous act, a cleansing. Their holy quest had begun. They had proven their faith. Their swords had tasted the blood of the unholy. And the story was just getting started. The journey to the Holy Land was an agony of years. It was a river of humanity flowing across a hostile world, bleeding members all along the way. They died of starvation, of thirst, of disease. They fought amongst themselves, but they were driven by that singular, powerful promise. The promise of Jerusalem, the promise of salvation. And in the summer of 1099, after years of unimaginable hardship and brutality, they arrived. They stood before the walls of the holy city. You can imagine them, can't you? Gaunt, sun-blackened, their armor rusted, their tunics frayed and stained. They were a mix of zealots, adventurers, and killers, and they looked at Jerusalem not as a city of living people, but as a prize, a sacred relic to be captured. The siege was long and bloody. They built wooden towers, monstrous things that rolled toward the stone walls. They fired catapults that smashed homes and filled the air with dust and screams. Inside the city, a mix of Muslims and Jews prepared for the inevitable. They had heard the stories. They knew what was coming. On July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders broke through. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter so complete, so inhuman, that even the chronicles of the time, written by men who were there, struggle to describe it. It was the ultimate expression of the sanctified sword. The Crusaders poured into the city not as soldiers, but as divine executioners. They had been told that the inhabitants were defilers, demons in human form. And with God's will as their shield and their blessed swords as their instruments, they unleashed a storm of violence that defies comprehension. They killed everyone. They surged through the narrow, winding streets, their armor clattering on the ancient stones. They kicked in the doors of homes. They killed the elderly in their beds. They killed mothers clutching their infants. They threw babies from the walls. They dragged people from their hiding places and cut them down in the streets. The accounts speak of blood, so much blood. Raymond of Aguilars, a chaplain who marched with the army, wrote that in the Solomon's Temple, now the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the slaughter was so great that his men waded in blood up to their ankles. Another chronicler, Fulcher of Chartres, who also participated, wrote, "Indeed, if you had been there, you would have seen our feet colored to our ankles with the blood of the slain. But what more shall I relate? None of them were left alive, neither women nor children were spared." He writes this not with shame, but with a kind of pious awe. This, to him, was the judgment of God. This was the purpose of his sword. Picture the scene: the blinding Middle Eastern sun, the air thick with the smoke of burning buildings and the metallic stench of blood. The only sounds are the screams of the dying, the triumphant shouts of the killers, and the rhythmic, percussive clang of steel on bone. A knight, his red cross now spattered with a darker red, corners a family in an alley. He sees not a father, a mother, a terrified child. He sees an obstacle, a stain to be removed from the holy city. His sword, blessed so long ago in a cold, distant church, rises and falls, and with each blow, he believes he is doing God's work. He believes he is earning his place in paradise. What does that do to a man? What happens to the human soul when it is convinced that the deepest act of cruelty is the highest form of worship? The sword did not make him do this. The religion did not, in its essence, command this. But the fusion of the two, the idea of a holy weapon, created a permission structure for the darkest parts of human nature to run free, draped in the robes of righteousness. For 2 days, the killing continued. When it was over, the city was a tomb. The Crusaders, exhausted and blood-soaked, then did something that shows the terrifying psychology of it all. They laid down their swords. They washed the blood from their hands and faces, and they walked, weeping with joy and religious fervor, to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where they believed Jesus was crucified and resurrected. They knelt at the empty tomb, their hearts full of ecstatic piety, and they gave thanks to God for their victory. They saw no contradiction. The blood on their boots and the prayers on their lips were part of the same sacred act. This was the crucible of the Crusades, a holy war that sanctified the sword and, in doing so, unleashed a new kind of horror on the world, a horror that could justify any action as long as it was done in the name of God. Before we follow the blood-stained legacy of these holy wars, as the idea of the sacred sword spreads and mutates, if you are finding these deep dives into the shadows of the past, help you find a place of quiet contemplation, consider subscribing to The Dark Historian. It allows these stories to continue being told. Now, back to the echoes of Jerusalem. The sack of the city was not an end. It was a beginning. It set a precedent. The First Crusade established crusader states in the Middle East, small islands of European feudalism in a hostile sea. For the next 200 years, the sword would be the primary tool of diplomacy, faith, and survival in the Holy Land. New kinds of warriors emerged, men who embodied this fusion of piety and violence. The Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, they were warrior monks, men who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and also swore to defend the Holy Land with the sword. Their blades were, again, sacred objects. They were extensions of their holy vows. The cross-guard of a Templar sword was not just for protecting the hand, it was a cross, a symbol to be kissed before battle. For these men, the sword was their life. It was their prayer. It was their identity. And this idea, that violence could be holy, was too powerful to remain confined to a distant land. The blessed sword soon found new enemies, much closer to home. In the early 13th century, in the beautiful, sun-drenched region of Languedoc in southern France, a different form of Christianity had taken root. They were known as the Cathars. They believed the material world was evil, a creation of a lesser god, and they rejected the authority and the wealth of the Catholic Church. To the Pope in Rome, this was a heresy more dangerous than any foreign faith. It was a cancer within the body of Christendom, and the cure was the same one that had been used in Jerusalem. The sword. The Pope called for a new crusade, not against Muslims in a foreign land, but against Christians in the heart of Europe. Knights and lords from northern France, eager for land and, of course, for the salvation promised to all crusaders, marched south. The Albigensian Crusade, as it came to be known, was exceptionally brutal. This was not a war against a foreign army. This was a war against a populace. It was a campaign of terror. The sack of the city of Béziers in 1209 is a chilling example. When the Crusaders breached the walls, they were faced with a dilemma. The city was a mix of Catholics and Cathars. How could they tell them apart? The story goes that the papal legate, a Cistercian abbot named Arnaud Amaury, was asked what to do. His supposed reply has echoed through the centuries as a perfect, terrifying summary of holy war. Quidite eos, navet enim dominus qui sunt ius. Kill them all. For the Lord knows those who are his own. We don't know for sure if he actually said those words, but the fact that they were recorded and believed tells you everything you need to know about the mindset of the time. The sword, once blessed by the Church, did not need to be precise. It did not need to distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. It only needed to fall. God would sort out the details later. The army took the advice to heart. The population of Béziers, tens of thousands of people, were massacred. Not a soul was left alive. The city was burned to the ground. The sword, in its holy work, had become an instrument of indiscriminate extermination. This happened again and again across the Languedoc. Castles were besieged. Villages were torched. The Cathar faith was systematically and brutally extinguished. The blessed sword had become a tool for enforcing theological purity. It was the ultimate argument in any doctrinal dispute, and so the nature of the sword was changed forever. It was no longer just a weapon of the state, or a tool for personal defense, or a symbol of a warrior class. It had been elevated. It had been given a divine mission. This legacy would cast a long, dark shadow. The justification for the Crusades, the idea that faith can not only permit but demand violence, would be used to rationalize countless conflicts to come. The Spanish Reconquista, the wars of religion that would tear Europe apart centuries, later the echoes of Deus Vult were there. The sword was now more than steel. It was an idea, a terrible, seductive idea. The idea that you could hold God's own judgment in your hand, that you could kill not only without sin, but for the good of your own soul. It is perhaps the heaviest burden ever placed upon a simple piece of sharpened metal. The image that remains is the one they chose for themselves, the blood-red cross on a white field, a symbol of Christ's sacrifice repurposed into a banner for war, a sign of peace worn by men whose swords dripped with the blood of the innocent. The idea was now loose in the world, an idea that a sword could be holy, and a holy sword never needs to be sheathed. And so, the idea of a holy sword spreads, a blade in service to a higher power. But gods can change, and the new God that the sword would come to serve was not one of stone or scripture. It was an idea, an invisible, all-consuming force that lived in the minds of men, a phantom they called honor. And this new God demanded blood, not on a grand battlefield, not in a crusade against a foreign enemy, but in quiet fields at dawn, in back alleys, in the cold morning mist between two men who, just yesterday, might have been friends. The sword of the night, the broad, heavy blade meant to crush mail and bone, was a clumsy tool for this new kind of worship. It was a weapon of war, of brute force. The new faith required something different, something faster, more personal, more precise. Enter the rapier. You've seen it in paintings and films, a long, slender needle of a sword, often with an intricate, basket-like hilt protecting the hand. It looks elegant, almost fragile compared to its ancestors. But don't be fooled. The rapier was not an ornament. It was a killer, refined to a singular, vicious purpose to puncture a human body. To understand the tyranny of honor, you first have to understand the weapon it chose as its instrument. The rapier wasn't about slashing. Its thin blade could cut, certainly, but its true genius was in the thrust, the point. A quick, subtle movement of the wrist could send that point darting forward like a serpent's tongue, slipping between ribs, piercing a lung, finding a heart. The fighting style it created was a deadly dance, a geometry of death. Men learned complex footwork, parries, feints, and lunges. Fencing masters grew rich teaching the sons of aristocrats how to kill with grace. They wrote books, filled with diagrams of angles and postures, turning personal combat into a brutal science. This wasn't the wild swinging of a battle axe. This was considered an art form, the highest expression of a gentleman's training. And every gentleman had to learn it, because in this era, from the 16th to the 18th century, your honor was everything. But what was it really? This thing they were willing to die for. It wasn't about being a good person. It wasn't about integrity or kindness. Honor, in this time, was about reputation. It was a public performance. It was the perception of your strength, your courage, your social standing, and it was incredibly fragile as a pane of glass, a misplaced word at a dinner party, a glance that lingered a moment too long on another man's wife, an accusation of cheating at cards, even something as trivial as being jostled in a crowded street without a proper apology. Any of these could be seen as a challenge to your honor, a stain upon your name, and there was only one way to wash that stain away, with blood. Imagine living in that world, a world of constant, simmering tension beneath a veneer of polite society. Every man you meet is armed. Every conversation carries the potential for a fatal misunderstanding. The pressure must have been immense. A young man, barely out of his teens, would be taught that to refuse a challenge, to refuse satisfaction, was social suicide. You would be branded a coward, ostracized. Your family would be shamed, your prospects ruined. In many ways, death was the easier option. And so, they died, in staggering numbers. Historians estimate that in France alone, during the reign of King Henry IV, as many as 10,000 gentlemen fell in duels. 10,000, over insults, over whispers, over nothing. This wasn't warfare. This was a social contagion, a sickness of pride. Think of the scene. It's almost always the same. A cold morning, just as the sun begins to bleed over the horizon. The dew is still wet on the grass. Two men stand opposite each other, clad not in armor, but in fine silk shirts. They are attended by their seconds, friends who are there to witness the duel and, if things went truly mad, to fight each other as well. There's a quiet formality to it, a ritual. The insults are repeated. A final chance to apologize is offered, but rarely taken. To back down now would be to admit you were wrong, to lose face. And so the coats are removed. The swords are drawn. The sound of steel sliding from a scabbard is a quiet, hungry sound. And then the dance begins. The blades meet with a sharp ring. A conversation in a language of pure violence. Faint parry, lunge. The shuffle of leather boots on the damp earth. The heavy breathing of two men. Fear and adrenaline making their hearts pound. They are focused entirely on the other man's eyes, and on the deadly point of his sword, looking for the slightest opening, the smallest mistake. It could be over in an instant. A sudden, blinding pain, a gasp, the unbelievable sensation of cold steel pushing deep inside you. Or it could be a slow, ugly affair, a series of small cuts, bleeding, weakening both combatants until one grows clumsy, until one makes that final, fatal error. When it was over, one man would be lying on the grass, his fine white shirt turning a brilliant, shocking red. The other would stand, breathing heavily, sword in hand. His honor, satisfied. But was it? What was truly gained? A man was dead, a family was shattered, a life full of potential snuffed out. The winner was often forced to flee, as dueling was officially illegal in most countries. Kings and cardinals condemned it. They passed edicts, threatening duelists with execution, with excommunication. It didn't work, because the unwritten law of honor was more powerful than the written law of the land. A king could take your life, but society could take your name. And for these men, the loss of their name was a fate worse than any gallows. This culture created a strange paradox. The sword, once a symbol of a knight's sworn duty to protect the weak, was now being used by the privileged to kill each other over the most trivial of matters. It was the ultimate expression of a toxic masculinity, a system where a man's worth was measured by his willingness to commit murder for the sake of his ego. Let's deconstruct one of these encounters. Picture two young nobles in Paris in the early 1600s. Let's call them Jean and Antoine. They move in the same circles. They attend the same parties. Perhaps they are even rivals for the affection of the same woman. One evening, at a crowded ball, Antoine makes a joke at Jean's expense. It's not a particularly cruel joke, but it's made in public. Others laugh. Jean feels his face flush with heat. He feels the eyes of everyone on him. In his mind, he has been diminished. His public image, his honor, has been challenged. He can't let it stand. Later that evening, he confronts Antoine. The words are quiet, formal, but laced with menace. "You have insulted me, sir." Antoine, caught up in his own pride, cannot simply apologize. That would be a sign of weakness, so he doubles down. "You are too sensitive, sir." And that's it. The die is cast. The challenge is issued and accepted. A time and place are set. Dawn, in the Bois de Boulogne, a park outside the city. Neither man will sleep that night. They will write letters, one to his mother, one to the woman they both admire. They will sit with their swords, cleaning them, checking the balance, feeling the familiar weight of the hilt in their hand. Are they brave? Or are they terrified? Most likely, they are both. They are boys, caught in a machine they did not build but are forced to operate. When they meet, the morning air is cold. It feels heavy with what is to come. Their seconds check the blades to ensure they are of equal length. No tricks, no advantages. This is, after all, a gentleman's affair. They salute each other with their rapiers. A final, chilling piece of etiquette, and then they fight. Jean is perhaps more skilled, but Antoine is quicker. The blades flicker in the pale light. The sounds are sharp, metallic, a high-pitched scrape as one blade slides down the other, a dull clang as a hilt is struck. For a few minutes there is only the dance, the footwork, the concentration. Then Antoine sees an opening. He lunges. Jean attempts to parry, but he is a fraction of a second too slow. The point of Antoine's rapier catches him in the side, just below the ribs. It is not a fatal wound. Not immediately, but it is deep. Jean stumbles back, his hand flying to the wound, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The duel is over. Honor has been satisfied, but the story doesn't end there. In an age before modern medicine, any puncture wound was a potential death sentence. Infection, internal bleeding. Jean is carried back to his home. A surgeon is called, but there is little that can be done. A fever sets in. Days later, Jean is dead. And what of Antoine? He is now a killer. He may feel a moment of triumph, but that will soon curdle into something else. Guilt, fear of reprisal from Jean's family, fear of the law. He has won the duel. He has defended his honor, and in doing so, he has destroyed at least 2 lives, his own and Jean's. Now multiply that story by thousands, tens of thousands. A constant, low-level bloodletting that robbed nations of their brightest and their bravest young men, all in service to a ghost, all for the sake of pride. The rapier was the perfect tool for this madness, but eventually it too was refined. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, fashion changed. Men began to wear lighter, more form-fitting clothes. The long, sometimes clumsy rapier was a bit much to carry around day to day. And so, the sword evolved once more. It became smaller, lighter, deadlier. It was called the small sword. If the rapier was a serpent, the small sword was a needle. It was shorter, almost weightless in the hand, and its blade was often triangular in cross-section. This shape made it incredibly stiff and strong for its size, but it also meant it had no cutting edge at all. It was a tool for one thing, and one thing only: the thrust. The wounds it created were small, neat, and almost impossible to survive. A small sword could slip between bones with horrifying ease. The triangular blade made a puncture that was difficult for surgeons to clean and stitch. It was, in essence, a surgical instrument designed for murder. The fighting style became even faster, more subtle. It was all about the wrist and the fingers. Tiny, precise movements. A flick of the wrist could be a death sentence. Dueling became quicker, more decisive, and even more common. It was no longer just the high aristocracy. Merchants, lawyers, anyone who considered himself a gentleman might find himself on the dueling ground. The sword was now fully divorced from the battlefield. It was no longer a weapon of war. It was a piece of personal attire, like a hat or a pair of gloves. And it was an arbiter of social disputes. It was the final word in any argument. This was the ultimate tyranny of the blade. It had inserted itself into the very fabric of civil society. The presence of the sword on every hip meant that any disagreement, no matter how petty, held the potential for lethal violence. It created a culture of paranoia and aggression, hidden just beneath the powdered wigs and polite manners. You had to constantly be on your guard. You had to watch what you said, how you looked at people, how you carried yourself. Because one wrong move, one perceived slight, and you could find yourself standing in a misty field at dawn, with a man you barely know trying to kill you with a sharpened piece of steel. And society expected it of you, demanded it. They called it courage, they called it gallantry, they called it honor, but it was none of those things. It was a form of madness, a ritualized, socially acceptable form of murder, fueled by ego and fear, the fear of being seen as less than a man. The sword, in this age, was not a symbol of strength, but a symbol of that very fear. It was a crutch for fragile egos, a way to enforce a brutal social order where the threat of violence was always hanging in the air. As the age of reason dawned, people began to question this culture. Voices of dissent grew louder. They pointed out the waste, the senselessness, the sheer, tragic stupidity of it all. But the tradition would die hard. The ghost of honor was not so easily exorcised. The small sword would continue to drink its fill of blood for many years to come, a testament to how a simple tool of metal and wood can become the focal point of a society's darkest impulses. The dance continued, its steps becoming ever more refined, its purpose ever more hollow. The sword was no longer holy. It was profane. A tool used to defend an idea that, when you look at it in the cold light of day, was worth nothing at all. And as the world moved towards revolution, towards industry, towards a new kind of warfare, the role of the sword was about to change again. Its time as the gentleman's arbiter was coming to a close. But its capacity for creating darkness, for enforcing tyranny, was far from over. It would simply find a new stage and new hands to wield it. And so, that new stage was set. Not on a European battlefield, but under the shadow of cherry blossoms and mountains shrouded in mist. The new hands to wield the blade were not knights in heavy plate, but silent figures in flowing robes, their faces impassive, their purpose absolute. We travel now to feudal Japan, a place so often painted with delicate watercolors of honor, discipline, and serene beauty. You know the image, the stoic warrior meditating under a waterfall, the master calligrapher, his brush strokes as precise as his sword cuts, the lone swordsman facing down a dozen foes, his victory a testament to a lifetime of training and a spirit forged in steel. This is the samurai we have been sold, a warrior poet, a philosopher with a blade. But that is only one story. It is the story told by the victors, by the ruling class. To find the dark history of the sword in this land, you have to look past the gleaming castles and the manicured Zen gardens. You have to walk the muddy roads between villages, stand in the rice paddies with the peasants, and listen to the stories that are not written down in the scrolls of the powerful. You have to listen for the whispers in the dark. This is welcome to the dark historian. Get comfortable. Dim the lights. Slow your breathing. Let the world outside fade away. We are here to look into the shadows, to understand that the most beautiful things can cast the darkest silhouettes. The story begins with the sword itself. The katana. Say the word, and an image springs to mind. A long, single-edged blade with a graceful, deadly curve. It is an icon of weapon design, a fusion of art and lethality, forged by masters in a near-religious process, folding the steel thousands of times, creating a blade that was both brutally hard on its edge and resilient in its spine. It is, without question, a masterpiece of metallurgy. But a masterpiece of what? Of killing, of course. And in feudal Japan, it was so much more than just a tool for war. For the samurai, the warrior caste who ruled the land, the katana was their soul. It was a symbol of their status, their authority, their very identity. They wore two swords, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi, a pairing called the daisho. And this pairing was a privilege granted only to them. To see a man wearing the daisho was to see power made manifest. It was a constant, silent declaration that he was of a higher order of being. And to the farmer, the merchant, the craftsman, to the vast majority of people, that symbol was not one of honor. It was a symbol of fear. Imagine you are a rice farmer in the 17th century. Your days are long, your back aches. Your life is dictated by the sun and the rain and the demands of the local lord. You walk a dusty road towards the market, hoping to sell a small portion of your harvest. Ahead, you see a samurai approaching. He is not in armor. He is not marching to war. He is simply walking, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his katana. What do? You do not meet his gaze. You immediately step off the road, into the mud or the ditch, and you bow. You bow low, your head nearly touching your knees, and you stay there. You do not move. You do not breathe too loudly. You wait until the soft sound of his sandals has faded into the distance. Why? Because you know that his mood, his whim, his interpretation of your posture could be the difference between your life and your death. This wasn't just social custom. This was law. The samurai class held the legal right of kirisut gomen. The phrase means permission to cut down and leave. It gave a samurai the authority to strike down a member of a lower class who had compromised their honor. And what constituted a compromise of honor? The definition was terrifyingly broad and entirely up to the samurai's interpretation. Failing to make way, bumping into his scabbard, an insolent look, a perceived insult. The samurai could kill you right there on the road, and as long as he could provide a plausible reason and report it to the authorities afterward, there would be no consequences. His word against a dead peasant's silence. Think about what that does to a society. It creates a world of constant, simmering anxiety. Every interaction with the ruling class is a tightrope walk over a pit of instant, violent death. The sword at the samurai's hip wasn't just for battle. It was a tool of social control, a constant reminder to the 90% of the population that their lives were conditional. Their existence was permitted, not guaranteed. The katana enforced a brutal caste system as surely as any prison wall. This absolute power was codified in their philosophy, the code we have come to romanticize Bushido, the way of the warrior. We hear of its tenets: loyalty, courage, compassion, honor, and for the samurai in their dealings with each other, with their lords, these ideals were paramount. But there is a darker side to Bushido, a side that is often conveniently ignored in popular culture. The code placed an enormous emphasis on the acceptance of death. To a samurai, life was fleeting, transient, like the cherry blossoms that bloom and fall in a matter of days. Death was the ultimate test of character. This philosophy made them fearless soldiers, certainly. But it also fostered a profound devaluing of life itself, especially the lives of those outside their class. If your own life was of little consequence, how much less was the life of a merchant who haggled over the price of fish? And this is where the story of the katana takes its darkest turn, into a practice that is almost too cruel to seem real. It is a practice called sujijiri. The word literally means crossroads killing. Imagine a swordsmith has just completed a new katana. It is a masterpiece. The hamen, the temper line along the edge, is like a wave frozen in steel. The balance is perfect. The polish is like a mirror. The samurai who commissioned it is pleased, but a question remains, a vital question. How well does it cut? How does it perform on a human body? An inanimate target, a roll of bamboo or a straw mat, can only tell you so much. The true test, the only test that mattered, was on flesh and bone. So, under the cover of darkness, the samurai would walk to a quiet road, a crossroads where travelers might pass, and he would wait. He is not waiting for an enemy. He is not waiting for a rival warrior. He is waiting for anyone, a lone traveler, a drunkard stumbling home from a tavern, a peasant, someone who would not be missed, or whose disappearance would not be investigated too deeply. The victim approaches. They have no idea. They are thinking of home, of their family, of the chill in the night air. And then, a shadow moves. There is a whisper of steel being drawn from its lacquered sheath. A single fluid motion. The blade, tested for the first time, does its work. The samurai does not linger. He might wipe the blade, observe the quality of the cut, and then simply walk away, leaving the body at the crossroads. This was tsujijiri. It was not a duel. It was not combat. It was murder for the sake of product testing. It was the ultimate expression of the samurai's power and the commoner's worthlessness. A human life extinguished simply to see if a new sword was sharp enough. The act was officially outlawed at times, but in a society where the enforcers of the law were the very ones committing the crime, such prohibitions were often meaningless. The practice continued in the shadows for centuries. Can you feel the coldness of that? The sheer, sociopathic detachment required to treat another human being as a piece of equipment to be tested. This is the shadow of the katana. For every story of a samurai defending a village, there are the unwritten stories of the villagers who were cut down on a dark road, their names and lives forgotten, their only purpose in history to be the whetstone for a warrior's new blade. Before we turn the blade inward and explore the darkness the samurai inflicted upon themselves, if you are finding these stories help you rest, consider subscribing to The Dark Historian. It allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten histories. Now, back to the cold steel and the long shadow it casts. The cruelty of the katana was not reserved solely for those of lower birth. The same philosophy that made a peasant's life disposable also created an intricate system of control within the samurai class itself. A system that demanded absolute loyalty and punished failure with a ritualized death of unimaginable agony. This is the ritual of seppuku. In the West, we often call it harakiri, which means bella cutting. But within the samurai class, the more formal term was seppuku. And like sujijiri, our modern perception of it is filtered through a romantic lens. We see it as the ultimate act of taking responsibility, of a warrior choosing to die with his honor intact rather than live with the shame of defeat or disgrace. And sometimes it was. But more often it was not a choice. It was a command. Let us dismantle the myth. Seppuku was a form of capital punishment, reserved for the samurai class. When a samurai committed a grave error, betrayed his lord, or failed in a crucial duty, he would be ordered, or sometimes permitted, to commit seppuku. Refusal was not an option. To refuse would bring disgrace not only upon himself, but upon his entire family. His name would be struck from the records. His children would become outcasts. His lands would be seized. The only path forward was a gruesome, public self-disembowelment. The ritual itself was precise and horrifying. Picture the scene: a quiet garden or a room in a temple. White sheets are laid upon the floor. The condemned samurai, bathed and dressed in a white kimono, the color of death, kneels silently. Before him, on a small wooden stand, is a short blade, the wakizashi, or a dagger called a tanto. He might be permitted a final poem, a few lines about the transient nature of life, written with a calm that belies the horror to come. Then he takes the blade. He opens his kimono, and he plunges the steel into the left side of his own abdomen. The cut is not a simple stab. He must draw the blade across his body to the right, and then, if he has the strength, turn the blade in the wound and cut upwards. It is a method designed to inflict the maximum possible pain and to ensure a slow, agonizing death. The purpose was to show his courage, his mastery over his own body and fear, even in his final moments. But the agony was often too great for even the most disciplined warrior. And so, a key figure stood behind him. This was the kaishakunin, or the second, usually a trusted friend or a skilled swordsman. His job was to stand ready with his own katana. As the condemned made the cut, or just after, the kaishakunin would perform a single, downward stroke to decapitate him, ending his suffering. This was presented as an act of mercy. But even this mercy could be a source of terror. The cut had to be perfect. A skilled kaishakunin would leave a small flap of skin at the front of the neck, so that the head would fall forward into the dead man's arms. a final gesture of embrace. A less skilled swordsman might botch the cut, striking the shoulder, or taking multiple swings. The final moments of an agonizing death could be transformed into a bloody, clumsy butchering. Now, step back from the ritual and see it for what it truly was. It was a tool of absolute control. A daimyo, a feudal lord, could eliminate a troublesome subordinate, a political rival, or a failed general, without ever having to dirty his own hands or be seen as a tyrant. He simply had to suggest that seppuku would be the honorable course of action. The social pressure, the threat to the samurai's family, did the rest. The blade, which was supposed to be the samurai's soul, became the instrument of his own coerced destruction. The philosophy of Bushido, which demanded he live and die with honor, was twisted into a weapon to ensure his absolute, unquestioning obedience. Question your lord, seppuku. Fail your mission, seppuku. Become a political inconvenience, seppuku. It was a perfect self-policing system of terror. The samurai, who held the power of life and death over the commoners, lived under their own sword of Damocles. They were both the enforcers and the victims of this brutal code. The katana was the symbol of this duality. It was the power they wielded over others, and the weapon that would inevitably be turned upon themselves, either by an enemy on the battlefield, or by their own hand in a quiet, white room. So, when you see a katana displayed in a museum, behind glass, remember what you are truly looking at. Do not just see the elegant curve, the beautiful temper line, the intricate wrappings on the hilt. See the blood that is not there. See the blood of the peasant on the dark road, his life taken for nothing. See the fear in the eyes of the merchant, bowing low, praying he has not given offense. See the blood of the samurai himself, staining the white robes, his life given not in a blaze of glory, but as the final move in a political game he was forced to play. The katana is beautiful, but its beauty is inseparable from its cruelty. It is an object forged in a culture that perfected the art of killing and then romanticized it. It represents a philosophy that raised one class of men to the status of demigods and reduced all others to dust, and it served as a constant, chilling reminder that in this world, honor was a luxury and life was a privilege that could be revoked in a single, silent, perfect cut. The story of this blade is not just one of warriors and battles, but of a quiet, pervasive terror that soaked the very soil of the land. It is a story of a weapon that was so intertwined with a culture's soul that it enforced a tyranny both outward and inward against the commoner and the warrior alike. But that inward-facing tyranny, that blade of social control, was only one half of the story. What happens when the terror is turned entirely outward? When a blade forged in the fires of one continent is carried across the sea to another, not to enforce an existing order, but to shatter one and build something new and terrible in its place. The story of the sword now leaves the islands of Japan and the fields of Europe. It boards a tall ship. It feels the salt spray and the endless roll of the ocean. It is a story that becomes inextricably linked with the creak of timber, the snap of a sail in the wind, and the dawning of a new, brutal age, the age of colonialism. And the swords of this era were different. They were tools, not just symbols. They were instruments of a vast, world-spanning machine. Think of the saber, not the elegant dueling blade, but its military cousin. A long, curved, single-edged sword. You can almost feel the weight of it in your hand. The guard is no longer a simple cross, but a complex basket of steel, a cage to protect the knuckles. This was not a weapon for a knight in shining armor. This was the weapon of the cavalry officer, the colonial administrator, the enforcer. Its curve was not for show. It was designed for a mounted man to slash downwards, to cleave through flesh and bone with the momentum of a charging horse. It was a weapon of shock, of awe, of swift and merciless violence. Then there was its grittier, more brutish relative, the cutlass, shorter, heavier, with a broad, thick blade. It was less a sword of finesse and more a sharpened crowbar. This was the tool of the sailor, the marine, the slaver. It was perfect for the close, frantic confines of a ship's deck during a boarding action. It could hack through thick rope, splinter a wooden door, and cut down a man with a single brutal blow. It was simple, cheap to produce, and terrifyingly effective. It was the fist of the empire. These two blades, the saber and the cutlass, became the steel teeth of European expansion. They were not merely weapons. They were declarations. The glint of a polished saber in the tropical sun was a statement of power, of perceived superiority. It said, "We are here, and this land is now ours." The blunt, ugly profile of the cutlass was a tool of business, the brutal, bloody business of conquest and exploitation. To understand their impact, you can't just look at the blades themselves. You have to travel with them. You have to stand on the shores of the worlds they invaded. Let us go first to the Americas. Imagine the air, thick with the scent of unfamiliar blossoms and damp earth. The year is 1521. You are in the heart of the Aztec Empire, the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan, a jewel of canals and pyramids rising from a lake. For generations, the Aztec warrior has been the master of this land. His weapon is the maquiohuitl, a fearsome tool, a wooden club, its edges studded with razor-sharp shards of obsidian. It can shatter bone, and it can decapitate a man. It is the product of a sophisticated culture, a weapon of ritual and war. Then the strangers arrive, men encased in steel, with faces covered by beards and iron. They ride upon creatures that seem like monsters, giant deer without horns. And in their hands they carry swords of a kind you have never seen. Long, thin, impossibly sharp blades of Toledo steel. The clash, when it comes, is not a battle of equals. It is a collision of worlds. The obsidian edges of the maquiohuitl, for all their sharpness, shatter against the tempered steel of the Spanish broadsword. The quilted cotton armor of the Aztec warrior, effective against his traditional foes, is sliced open as if it were paper. The Spanish sword doesn't just cut, it thrusts. A long, piercing point that can find the gaps in any defense, that can punch through a shield and into the heart behind it. Picture the scene. A narrow causeway in Tenochtitlan. The air is filled with the screams of men and the high, ringing shriek of steel on steel. A Spanish conquistador, his armor dented and smeared with blood, stands over a fallen eagle warrior. His sword, a simple cross-hilted blade, is an extension of his will. It is a product of centuries of European warfare, of constant conflict, of an arms race that honed steel into the deadliest instrument on the planet. The Aztec warrior fought for his city, his gods, his people. The Spaniard fought for gold, for glory, and for a god he believed had given him dominion over this new world. And his sword was the physical manifestation of that belief. It was a slaughter, a genocide enacted not just by disease and firearms, which were often slow and unreliable, but by the relentless, intimate brutality of the sword. The sword was the tool that carved up the Aztec and Incan empires, that toppled kings and tore down temples. It was the instrument that enforced the will of a few hundred men upon millions. It was the ultimate argument in any negotiation, the final word in any dispute. It drank the blood of a continent and left scars that have never truly healed. The age of the sword in the Americas was an age of profound and catastrophic loss. Now, let the currents carry us across the Atlantic to the coast of Africa. Here, the story of the colonial blade takes on an even darker, more commercial tone. The sword is no longer just a weapon of conquest. It becomes an instrument of the trade, the most monstrous trade in human history. Picture the sweltering heat of a place like Elmina Castle, on the Gold Coast. A stone fortress bleached white by the sun, overlooking the endless blue of the ocean. This is not a king's palace. It is a warehouse, a processing center for human cargo. And everywhere, there is the glint of steel. The European slavers and their local agents used the sword to capture people from their villages, to march them for hundreds of miles in chains, to hold them in the suffocating dungeons of the fort. The cutlass was the favored tool. Its heavy blade was an effective deterrent. A single, brutal swing could make an example of anyone who dared to resist. It was the tool used to break the spirit, to sever the bonds of family and community, to turn a human being into a commodity. Imagine the hold of a slave ship, the darkness, the stench, the suffocating air, the sound of weeping and the rattling of chains. The only light comes from a lantern held by an overseer, and in his other hand, a cutlass. It is a constant, silent threat. It is the enforcer of a fragile, violent order in a floating hell. It is used to put down uprisings with pitiless butchery. It is used to cut down those who succumb to disease or despair, their bodies thrown to the sharks. On these ships, the cutlass was not a weapon of war. It was a tool of industrial-scale human suffering. It had no honor. It had no glory. It was simply a piece of sharpened steel used to manage inventory, an inventory of living souls. This blade didn't just kill bodies. It was an essential part of a system designed to annihilate identity, to erase history, and to create a permanent underclass whose labor would build the wealth of empires an ocean away. The sheer scale of this human tragedy, enforced by cold steel, is difficult to comprehend. The blade was a constant presence, a symbol of the absolute power of the captor over the captive. Before we follow these blades further into the heart of the empires they built, a quick moment. If you find these historical explorations valuable, and if they help you find stillness in the dark, a simple subscription to The Dark Historian helps us continue to unearth these stories. We appreciate your support. Now, back to the polished steel of the officer's saber and the shadow it cast across the globe. Let us travel east to the vast and ancient lands of India. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the British are no longer just traders. They are rulers. The British East India Company, a private corporation, has its own army, and it has conquered a subcontinent. The symbol of its authority is the British officer, immaculate in his red coat, and at his side, the ever-present saber. Here, the sword story is one of occupation. It is the tool used to enforce British law, to collect taxes, and to put down any hint of rebellion. The British officer's saber was a thing of factory-made precision. Thousands upon thousands were churned out of the forges of Birmingham and Sheffield, each one identical to the last. They were a product of the Industrial Revolution, a symbol of a new kind of power, a power based on mass production and relentless efficiency. The Indian subcontinent, of course, had its own ancient and proud tradition of sword-making. The tulwar, with its gracefully curving blade and distinctive disc pommel, was a weapon of incredible beauty and lethality. The Rajput warrior with his khanda, a straight, double-edged sword, was a fearsome opponent. But they were facing an enemy that could equip entire armies with high-quality steel, an enemy with a logistical chain that stretched around the world. The clash was not just of steel, but of systems. The artisan's forge against the industrial factory, the warrior's code against the soldier's drill manual. Think of the Indian Mutiny of 1857. It was a desperate, bloody explosion of rage against British rule, and it was a war fought with swords on both sides. Sepoys, the Indian soldiers who rebelled against their British officers, used their co-issued sabers against their former masters. British cavalry regiments, like the 9th Queen's Royal Lancers, rode into battle, their own sabers flashing as they cut down mutineers. It was a war of intimate, savage violence. In the streets of Delhi and Lucknow, the fighting was hand to hand. The saber was not a distant, impersonal weapon like a rifle. To kill with it, you had to be close enough to see the look in your enemy's eyes. You had to feel the shocking impact as the blade bit into flesh and bone. The stories from this conflict are filled with horrific accounts of sword-inflicted wounds, of men hacked to pieces in the chaos of a cavalry charge or a desperate last stand. The saber, in this context, was the symbol of a fractured world. The same weapon, held in a British hand, represented order, discipline, and the right to rule. Held in an Indian hand, it represented rebellion, chaos, and a fight for freedom. The blade itself was neutral, but the hands that held it and the ideas behind those hands gave it its terrible meaning. It was the tool that both maintained and tore apart an empire. This pattern was repeated across the globe. In China, during the Opium Wars, British naval officers with cutlasses led boarding parties onto Chinese junks. In Africa, during the scramble for Africa, European officers with sabers led columns of native soldiers, armed with rifles, to carve out vast colonial territories. The sword was often the personal weapon of the commander, the symbol of his authority, while the rifle was the tool of the common soldier. The sword became part of the uniform of empire. It was a piece of ceremonial dress, polished to a mirror shine for parades and official functions. It was a badge of rank, a sign that you were one of the rulers, not one of the ruled. A young officer, fresh from Britain, would buy his saber, his name perhaps etched into the blade, and sail to a distant corner of the world. That sword might never be drawn in anger. It might only ever be used to salute a flag or a superior officer, but its presence was enough. It was a constant, unspoken reminder of the violence that underpinned the entire colonial project. The local population saw that sword. They knew what it was for. They knew that behind the veneer of civility, of trade, of civilizing missions, there was the hard, sharp edge of steel. They knew that the peace was kept not by consent, but by the threat of force. And the saber, hanging at the officer's hip, was the most personal and potent symbol of that threat. It created a psychological divide. For the colonizer, the sword was a link to a chivalric, knightly past, a fantasy of noble warfare, even as they engaged in brutal suppression. It allowed them to see themselves as honorable warriors, bringing order to a chaotic world. For the colonized, it was something else entirely. It was the blade that had killed their ancestors. It was the blade that had enforced unjust laws. It was the blade that represented their own subjugation. You can see it in old photographs. The British officer standing tall, one hand resting casually on the pommel of his saber, while local people stand around him, their eyes downcast. The power dynamic is perfectly encapsulated in that simple image. The sword is the fulcrum upon which that entire scene balances. And so, the blade that had once been the soul of the warrior, the symbol of his personal honor, became something else. It became a tool of administration, an item on a military ledger, a mass-produced instrument of a global economic and political system. It was a long, long way from the master smith, forging a single katana in a sacred ritual. The soul of the sword, if it ever had one, was now the cold, calculating soul of empire. It had carved up the world, redrawn maps, and funneled the wealth of continents into the coffers of Europe. The sun, it was said, never set on the empires these blades had helped to build. But a new sun was rising, one forged not in a blacksmith's fire, but in the roaring furnaces of the factory, an industrial sun. And the age of the sword, as a king of the battlefield, was drawing to a close. Its final, desperate charges were yet to come, against an enemy it could not see, and could never hope to cut down. But even as the age of the sword on the grand battlefield began its slow fade, its story was far from over. It did not go quietly into that long night. Instead, it raged. It roared. It had one last, terrible song to sing. A song written not in honor or loyalty, but in blood and coin. This was the age of the mercenary. The knight, with his codes and his oaths, was becoming a relic. A beautiful, expensive, and increasingly ineffective relic. The new power in Europe was not the landed lord, but the man with the fullest war chest. The man who could afford to buy an army, and the men who made up these armies were a new breed of warrior. They fought for the highest bidder. Their allegiance was to the contract, and their god was the gilder. And to understand this brutal, transactional age of warfare, you have to picture them. The Landsknechts, German soldiers of fortune who became the terror and the masters of the Renaissance battlefield. Imagine a river of men flowing across the landscape. They are not a uniform army, far from it. They are a carnival of death. Each man is an explosion of color, puffed sleeves, slashed breeches, layers of vibrant, clashing fabrics. A peacock's pride in every step. They wore their wealth on their backs, the silks and velvets looted from 100 sacked towns. Their hats are enormous, adorned with impossibly large ostrich feathers that bob and weave in the wind. But don't let the finery fool you. Look closer, look at the faces beneath the feathered hats. They are hard, scarred. The eyes are cold, pragmatic. These are not boys playing at war, they are professionals. Their flamboyant dress is a statement of defiance, a middle finger to the sober, restrictive dress codes of the cities they so often terrorized. It said, "I am a free man. I answer to no one but my captain and my pay." And then you see the steel. Rising above the sea of colorful hats and feathered plumes are the blades, and they are monstrous. These are the Zweihänder, the two-handers, swords so large they are almost polearms. They are not worn on the hip, they are carried on the shoulder like a woodsman's axe. The blades are as long as a man is tall, with a second, leather-wrapped grip above the crossguard, the ricasso, for finer control in the crush of battle. This is not a dueling sword. It is not a weapon of finesse. It is an instrument of demolition. Its purpose was singular and terrifying, to break the unbreakable. In this era, the king of the battlefield was the pike square, a bristling hedgehog of 18-foot-long spears, impenetrable to cavalry, a slow-moving fortress of men and wood and steel. An army that could break the enemy's pike formation won the day, and that was the job of the men who wielded the Zweihänder. They were called the Doppelsöldner, the double-pay men. They earned twice the wage of a normal soldier, and every single coin was paid for in risk. They were the forlorn hope, the men who marched in the very front rank, directly into the wall of sharpened spear points. Picture the moment. The drums are beating a steady, heart-pounding rhythm. The two armies grind slowly toward each other across a field of mud and grass. On one side, a forest of pikes lowers, a solid wall of death. On the other, the Landsknechts advance, and at their head, the Doppelsöldner. They grip their massive swords, their knuckles white. They are not charging, not yet. They are walking, a steady, menacing pace. As they get closer, they begin to swing the huge blades, not to strike, but to build momentum. The swords whistle through the air, great silver arcs of menace. It is pure psychological warfare, a promise of what is to come. Then the command is given, and they run. They run into the points of the pikes. Their job is not necessarily to kill, not at first. Their job is to destroy the formation. With massive, full-body hews, they swing the Zweihänder. The goal is to shatter the wooden shafts of the pikes, to knock aside the point, to create a gap, just a small one, a moment of chaos. That is all their brothers in arms behind them need to surge forward with their own pikes and shorter swords. Many of these double-pay men die in the first few seconds, impaled, overwhelmed. But if they succeed, if they create that breach, the battle is won. They are the key that unlocks the enemy's door, and the price of that key is blood. The Zweihander was the tool for the big work, for breaking the lines. But the soul of the Landsknecht was found in his other sword, the one he lived with every day. It was called the Katzbalger, the cat's kinner. It was a short sword, an arming sword, but unique in its design. It had a distinctive S-shaped guard that fit perfectly over the knuckles. It wasn't elegant. It was a brutish, simple tool. It was the weapon for the work that came after the pike walls broke, when the battle dissolved from organized formations into 1,000 individual struggles for life and death. In the mud, in the press of bodies, where a long spear or a giant two-hander was useless, the Katzbalger came out. It was a weapon for close, ugly, desperate fighting, for the skinning of cats, as the saying went, for the grim business of killing a man who was too close to miss. This was the life of a Landsknecht, a life of extreme risk and extreme violence. But why? Why choose this? For many, there was no other choice. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were a time of upheaval. Old feudal structures were crumbling. There were thousands of young men with no land, no inheritance, and no prospects. But they had their health and a tolerance for violence. The mercenary companies offered something no one else could: a chance for wealth, for adventure, for a life outside the rigid class structure of the day. They offered a brutal, bloody form of social mobility. A man could join a company as a lowly pikeman and, if he was skilled, brave and lucky, could rise to be a captain. He could earn enough to buy his own land, to become a lord in his own right. It was a dark and terrible dream, but it was a dream nonetheless. And these companies were more than just armies. They were moving societies. A Landsknecht army on the march was a city on the move. There was the Tross, a massive baggage train of wagons, carrying supplies, plunder, and people. Thousands of camp followers trailed the soldiers' wives, children, merchants, artisans, cooks, priests, and prostitutes. It was a complete, self-contained world, with its own laws, its own culture, and its own brutal justice system. A man could be hanged for desertion in the morning, and be celebrated for his bravery in the afternoon. Life was cheap, and loyalty was to the man next to you in the shield wall, and to the captain who ensured the pay arrived on time. And that was the core of it all. The pay. A Landsknecht's loyalty was not to a king, or a nation, or a god. It was to the paymaster. This made them incredibly effective soldiers. They weren't fighting for some abstract ideal of patriotism. They were fighting for their livelihood. War was their trade, and they were masters of it. But it also made them incredibly dangerous. What happens when the pay is late? What happens when the prince who hired you runs out of gold? This is where the story of the mercenary sword turns its darkest. When the money stopped, the Landsknechts invoked what they called self-payment. If their employer could not pay them, they would pay themselves, by taking it from the land, from the towns and villages their employer was supposed to be protecting. A town that found itself unable to pay the wages of the mercenary company garrisoned within its walls faced a terrible choice. They could try to refuse and be utterly destroyed, or they could allow the sack. Imagine you are a baker in a small German town in 1525. For months, the Landsknechts hired by your local duke have been quartered here. At first it was fine. They spent their coin. They kept to themselves, mostly. But now the news has come. The duke has lost a major battle. His treasury is empty. The pay is not coming. A terrifying stillness falls over the town. The soldiers who were once your protectors are now your captors. Their friendly greetings are replaced with cold stares. The laughter from their taverns turns hard, menacing. You see them sharpening their Katzbalgers not for an enemy, but for you. Their captain presents the town council with an ultimatum. Pay the company's wages in full within 24 hours, or the town will be given over to the men for 3 days. It is an impossible sum. The town is not wealthy. There is no way. The church bells ring not for prayer, but for warning. You bar your door. You hide your wife and children in the cellar. You pray, but you know it is hopeless. Then you hear it, the splintering of wood, the roar of a crowd, the screaming begins. The sack has started. This was not mindless chaos. It was a cold, calculated, and organized affair. The soldiers would go from house to house, systematically stripping it of anything of value. Coin, silver, jewelry, fine cloth, anything that could be carried and sold. Resistance was met with swift, brutal violence. Murder was common. Torture, to find where a family might have hidden their valuables, was a tool of the trade. The town became a marketplace of horrors, and the only currency was pain. The sword, in these moments, was not a weapon of war. It was an instrument of terror. A Katzbalger held to a throat was not about defeating an enemy combatant. It was about leverage. It was a tool of extortion. It was the final, terrifying argument in a negotiation where one side held all the power. For 3 days, the town would be consumed, and at the end, the landsknechts would march away, their wagons heavy with plunder, leaving behind a smoking, broken shell of a community, lives shattered, families destroyed, a generation of trust and prosperity wiped out, all because a contract had been broken. Before we follow these soldiers of fortune to their next contract and witness the greatest atrocity they would ever commit, take a moment. If you are finding these dark histories help you quiet your mind and find rest, consider subscribing to The Dark Historian. A simple click supports the telling of more stories like this one. Now, settle back in. Let the darkness take you. We return to the march. The mercenary sword didn't just cause suffering, it fed on it. These companies had a vested interest in perpetual conflict. Peace was bad for business. Peace meant unemployment. A savvy mercenary captain knew how to play both sides, how to ensure that a small conflict never quite resolved, but instead festered, escalated, requiring his company's services for another season. They were the ultimate war profiteers, and their business was booming. They became a cancer on the European continent. Kings and princes would hire them to fight their wars, only to find they couldn't afford to get rid of them. The army you hired to defeat your enemy could become your own worst nightmare. The moment your treasury ran dry, they were a force of pure destabilizing chaos, all for the sake of a full purse and a steady contract, and this all reached its terrible crescendo in the year 1527. An enormous army of nearly 20,000 imperial troops, many of them German landsknechts, were marching down the Italian peninsula. They were fighting for the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. But Charles was a world away, and his coffers were, once again, empty. The army was mutinous. They hadn't been paid in months. They were hungry, angry, and they were marching on the richest city in all of Christendom. They were marching on Rome. The Eternal City was, at the time, considered almost untouchable. It was the heart of the Catholic faith, a city of pilgrims, priests, and priceless art. It was defended by a small papal army and the legendary Swiss Guard. But it was not prepared for the fury that was coming. The imperial army, under the command of a French duke, arrived outside the walls of Rome. The assault began. In the initial fighting, the French duke was killed, leaving the army effectively leaderless. There was no one to hold them back, no one to enforce discipline. There was only rage and greed, and the promise of unimaginable plunder. They breached the walls. What followed was one of the most brutal and infamous events of the Renaissance. The sack of Rome. The landsknechts, many of whom were Lutheran Protestants, and held a deep-seated hatred for the papacy, poured into the city with a special kind of fury. This was not just about payment. This was about vengeance. They swarmed through the ancient streets, a tide of violence and destruction. They slaughtered the city's defenders. The Swiss Guard made a heroic, suicidal last stand on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, buying precious time for the Pope to escape through a secret passage. Nearly all of them were killed where they stood. And then the city was helpless. For more than a week, Rome was subjected to an orgy of destruction that shocked the civilized world. Nothing was sacred. Churches were looted, their ancient relics smashed or stolen. Palaces were burned. The Vatican Library, one of the greatest collections of knowledge in the world, was ransacked, its priceless manuscripts used as bedding for horses. Nuns were dragged from their convents. Priests were murdered at the altar. Citizens were tortured and killed in the streets for sport or for the location of their imagined wealth. The swords of the Landsknechts, the Zweihänder and the Katzbalger, were put to their most profane use. They were used to pry open chests, to terrorize families, to deface priceless works of art by Michelangelo and Raphael. The sword, once the symbol of the crusader defending the faith, was now being used by soldiers of fortune to desecrate the very heart of that faith. It was the ultimate, terrible irony. When the horror finally subsided, Rome was a ruin. Tens of thousands were dead. The city's population had been more than halved. 1,000 years of art and culture had been obliterated. The Landsknechts and other soldiers eventually marched away, their pockets full, their souls irredeemably stained, leaving a ghost city behind them. The sack of Rome was a turning point. It showed the world the ultimate consequence of this new form of warfare. It was a war unbound by honor, by faith, by anything other than the cold, hard logic of profit and survival. The sword in the hand of the Landsknecht was not a symbol of justice or nobility. It was a tool of acquisition. A crowbar, a threat, a means to an end. And so, the image of the sword, that shining blade of so many legends, was forever tarnished. It had become the emblem of the soulless soldier, the man who kills not for a cause, but for a contract. The romantic ideal of the knight was truly dead, hacked to pieces in the muddy streets of 100 sacked towns, and buried for good under the rubble of Rome. The sword's long, slow descent from a mythical object to a simple tool of violence was nearly complete. Its world was changing. The battlefield was growing louder, smokier. The clean, sharp ring of steel on steel was being drowned out by the roar of cannons and the crack of the arquebus. But the sword was not a creature of the battlefield alone. As its relevance there waned, it found new life and new darkness, not in the hands of soldiers in an open field, but in the hands of individuals in the shadows of alleys and in the formal, deadly dance of the duel. The age of blood for coin was passing. A new age of blood for pride was about to begin. And so, the idea of pride entered the equation, not just the pride of a single warrior, but the collective pride of a nation, a city, a faith. The sword, once a tool for personal survival or paid violence, was about to be consecrated in the name of something much larger and far more dangerous, an idea, because an idea, unlike a king or a paymaster, is boundless. It has no treasury to run dry. It has no single body to be struck down. It lives in the hearts of thousands. And when that idea convinces those thousands that their neighbors are no longer neighbors, but stains to be cleansed, the sword finds a terrible new purpose. To understand this, you have to imagine a city. Paris, August 1572. The air is thick with summer heat, and a tension you can almost taste. It's the kind of tension that makes a dropped shutter sound like a gunshot, the kind that makes you watch the eyes of the people you pass in the street. A royal wedding was meant to soothe these tensions, to stitch together the deep, ragged wound between the Catholics and the Protestant Huguenots, but the stitches were not holding. The wound was festering. For years, the conflict had been a formal one, armies meeting on fields of battle, sieges and skirmishes. But now the conflict had come home. It was in the bakeries, the taverns, the quiet courtyards. It was a poison in the water supply of the soul. An assassination attempt on a Huguenot leader was the spark. The Royal Council, fearing a Protestant uprising, made a decision. A preemptive strike, a purge. They didn't need to assemble an army. The army was already there, sleeping in their beds all across the city. Ordinary men, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, boatmen. All they needed was a signal. Imagine you are there, in a small room overlooking a narrow, cobbled street. The night is stifling. You can't sleep, and then you hear it. A bell, not the usual gentle call to matins. This is frantic, a clanging, insistent alarm, first from the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, then answered by others, one by one, a chorus of iron tongues screaming into the darkness. This is the signal. Doors splinter open. The night air, once still, is filled with the sound of running feet. Not the measured tread of a city watch patrol, but the chaotic, stumbling rush of a mob. And with it, a new sound. The sound of steel being drawn, not the clean hiss of a soldier's longsword, but the rasp of 100 different blades. Short swords, daggers, cleavers from a butcher's shop, long knives from a kitchen. The killing begins. It is not a battle. It is a hunt. The victims are dragged from their beds, confused and terrified. The violence is intimate, terrifyingly personal. A sword is not a musket. You cannot kill from a distance. You have to be close enough to see the pleading in their eyes, close enough to be spattered by the result. Picture a man, a tailor perhaps, standing over his neighbor, a man he has known for years, a man with whom he has shared wine and bread. In his hand he holds a short, heavy blade, perhaps an arming sword his grandfather once carried. The weapon feels clumsy, alien, but the bell is still ringing, and the men in the street are shouting prayers and curses, and the priest on the corner has promised salvation for this night's work. He is not killing a neighbor. He is cleansing his city. He is serving his God. The steel feels heavy, but he raises it. The narrow streets of Paris become channels for blood. The work is frenzied, disorganized, fueled by a potent cocktail of fear, religious fervor, and the simple, terrifying permission to unleash the worst parts of human nature. A sword in the hand of a trained soldier is a tool of grim purpose. But a blade in the hand of a fanatic is something else entirely. It is a holy instrument. Every thrust, every slash is a prayer. The screams of the dying are a hymn. This went on for days. The violence spilled out from Paris into the French countryside. The estimates vary, as they always do, but tens of thousands were cut down. The River Seine was said to have run red, clogged with the bodies of men, women, and children. And at the heart of it all was that simple, terrible piece of technology, a sharpened length of steel. It allowed a mob's hatred to become brutally, physically real. It translated abstract belief into tangible, bloody death, one life at a time, thousands of times over. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre wasn't a military operation. It was a harvest, a red harvest, reaped with blades in the heart of a supposedly civilized city. The sword here was not a weapon of war, but a tool of extermination. It revealed a dark truth about its own nature. It is an amplifier. In the hands of a mob, it takes simmering resentment and turns it into a bloodbath. It gives physical form to the ugliest of ideas. Before we travel east, to a conflict where the scale of this bloodshed becomes almost unimaginable, let's pause for a moment in the quiet of this history. If you find these explorations into the shadows of our past a source of quiet contemplation, a way to settle your own mind, consider supporting the channel by subscribing. It allows these stories to continue. Now, let us leave the smoke-filled streets of Paris and journey to a place where the sword was not an instrument of chaotic fury, but of cold, methodical, state-sponsored annihilation. We must go back much further in time, to the 3rd century before the Common Era, to the land we now call China. This was the Warring States period, a name that is almost too simple for the reality. It was an age of colossal armies, ruthless warlords, and a philosophy of war that was terrifyingly modern in its brutality. This wasn't about religious purity. It was about something far more pragmatic: survival, unification, power. 7 major states were locked in a death spiral, a century-spanning conflict where the only conceivable end was the complete and utter destruction of all rivals. And in this crucible of unending war, the sword became more than a soldier's sidearm. It became an instrument of policy. The state of Qin in the West was the most ruthless of them all. Their entire society was geared for war. Every farmer was a potential soldier, every craftsman a potential weapons maker. They practiced a philosophy of legalism, which was as cold and hard as the iron they forged into blades. It taught that the only way to control people was through strict laws and harsh punishments. The only way to win a war was through total, uncompromising victory. This meant not just defeating an enemy army, but erasing it. And this brings us to a place called Changping, a series of mountain passes in northern China. In the year 260 BC, the 2 titans of the age, the Qin and the Zhao, met here for what would be the decisive battle of the era. This was not a skirmish. This was warfare on a scale that Europe would not see for another 2,000 years. The armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. For months, they faced each other across a fortified line, a stalemate. But the Qin were masters of deception. Their general, Bai Kai, feigned a retreat, luring the entire Zhao army out of its defensive positions and into a trap. The Qin forces then swept around, cutting off the Zhao supply lines and surrounding them completely. Imagine it, nearly 500,000 Zhao soldiers, trapped in a valley. Their food runs out. They are reduced to eating the dead. Their attempts to break out are thrown back with merciless slaughter. For 46 days this continues. Finally, starving and broken, the Zhao army surrenders. Now, what do you do with 400,000 prisoners of war? In a different time, a different place, they might be ransomed. They might be enslaved. But this was the state of Qin, and their philosophy was one of absolute eradication. These soldiers were not a resource to be exploited. They were a threat to be eliminated. If they were allowed to return home, they would simply be rearmed and sent to fight again. The state of Zhao had to be broken, not just on the battlefield, but in its very soul. Its entire generation of young men had to be wiped from the earth. The order was given. The prisoners were to be executed. All of them. Think about the logistics of that. The sheer, mind-numbing horror of the task. This could not be done with arrows. They were too valuable. It had to be done up close. It had to be done with swords. The Zhao soldiers, disarmed and weak from starvation, were marched into pits. And the Qin soldiers, their own comrades, began the work. This was not the hot-blooded, frenzied killing of a Parisian mob. This was a cold, systematic process, an assembly line of death. A soldier would stand his jian, a straight, double-edged sword, held ready. A prisoner would be forced to kneel. There would be a swing, a sound, and then the next. Over and over and over again. Try to put yourself in the mind of a Qin soldier. The first kill is the hardest. The 10th is easier. By the 100th, what are you even feeling? The arm aches, the muscles burn. The grip on the sword is slick. The air is thick with the coppery smell of blood. The ground underfoot turns to a sucking mire. The sounds are a constant, low moan of human misery. The sword itself changes. Its one keen edge dulls against bone and gristle. It becomes a bludgeon as much as a blade. It is no longer a noble weapon, a duelist's tool. It is a piece of farm equipment for a harvest of men. It is a butcher's cleaver. The historical accounts say that Bai Kai, the Qin general, had some 240 of the youngest Zhao soldiers spared, only to be sent back to their home state to spread the news, to spread the terror. The message was clear: resist us, and this is your fate. We will not just defeat you. We will annihilate you. 400,000 men, killed by hand, with swords. It's a number so large it becomes abstract. It's hard to even picture, but for the men who did the killing, it was not abstract at all. It was the weight of the sword in their hand. It was the jarring impact, again and again. It was the silence that fell over the valley when the work was finally done. Here, the sword was the ultimate expression of the state's will. It was the final, brutal tool of a political philosophy that valued power above all else. Each swing was not an act of passion, but an act of policy. Each death was not a tragedy, but a statistic, a step closer to the ultimate goal of a unified empire, built on a foundation of bones. What these two events show us, separated by nearly 2,000 years and half a world, is the terrifying versatility of the sword. It is perfectly suited to the madness of a mob, its light weight and sharp edge allowing for quick, chaotic death in a narrow alley. But it is also grimly efficient for the methodical, industrial-scale slaughter of a disciplined army. It forces a confrontation. The executioner at Changping could not look away. He saw every face. He heard every last breath. The rioter in Paris, in his fervor, saw not a person but an idea he had to destroy. In both cases, the blade served as the bridge between a thought and a terrible act. It made the abstract lethal. This is a darker chapter in the sword's long story. We often romanticize it. We picture the knight's chivalry, the samurai's honor. We see the duel at dawn, a contest of skill and courage, but the sword has another face. It is the face of the executioner, the face of the fanatic. It is the tool that has, throughout history, been used to reap fields of human beings in the name of a god, a king, or a political agenda. It is a reminder that the weapon itself possesses no morality. It is a blank slate, a sharpened piece of potential. It reflects only the intent of the hand that wields it. And too often, that hand has been driven by the darkest impulses of the human heart: hatred, fear, and the cold, unblinking calculus of power. The silence that follows such a harvest is a profound one. It is the silence of a world emptied, a silence filled only by the quiet dripping of blood from 1,000 stained and silent blades. And from that silence, a new sound begins to grow. At first, it is almost imperceptible, a low hum on the far horizon. Not the sound of men or horses, but of something else entirely. It is the sound of the forge, not the swordsmith's little workshop with its rhythmic hammerfall, but a vast and terrible forge, the forge of a new century, a forge that burns coal by the ton and spits out steel by the mile, a forge that doesn't craft tools for a single hand, but builds engines of immense, impersonal power. For a time, the sword does not hear it. It rests in its scabbard, polished and proud. It is still a symbol, a marker of an officer, a gentleman. It is the final, gleaming statement of a warrior's identity. The men who carry it still believe in its power, not just to cut, but to inspire. They believe in the charge. In the glory of 1,000 horsemen cresting a hill, sabers held high, sunlight catching on the steel like a wave of captured stars. It is a beautiful, intoxicating idea. An idea that has been the bedrock of warfare for millennia. But the humming on the horizon is getting louder. It is the sound of rifling being carved into cannon barrels. The sound of chemical compounds being mixed into high explosives. It is the steady, patient clatter of 1,000 identical cartridges being filled, crimped, and boxed. And most of all, It is the sound of a new kind of heartbeat, a mechanical heartbeat, a water-cooled, belt-fed heart that can pump out 600 pieces of lead in a single minute. The sword, in all its handcrafted glory, in all its storied history, is about to meet the machine, and the meeting will not be a duel. It will be an execution. This is welcome to the dark historian. Get comfortable. Dim the lights. Slow your breathing. Let the world outside fade away. The story of the sword is nearing its end, but its final moments on the field of battle are perhaps its most tragic and its most haunting. Imagine the year is 1914. The air across Europe is thick with something more than the coming autumn chill. It is thick with patriotism, thick with certainty. The posters on the walls show handsome young men in immaculate uniforms, pointing heroically towards a distant, unseen foe. The newspapers speak of honor, of duty, of a swift and decisive victory. It will all be over by Christmas, they say. And the men who march off to war believe it. They are the sons of a long peace, raised on stories of their grandfathers' glorious campaigns. Wars of movement, of cavalry screens and decisive, shocking charges. You can almost feel their confidence, the crisp wool of their uniforms, the well-oiled leather of their boots and saddles, and at their side, the saber. For the cavalryman, it is more than a weapon. It is an extension of his arm, his will, his very spirit. The French have their MLE 1822 light cavalry saber, a graceful, curved blade designed for the slash. The British carry the 1908 pattern, a brutally simple, straight-bladed sword built for one purpose, and one purpose only, the thrust. Its designer called it the most perfect thrusting sword ever made. The German Uhlans and cuirassiers carry their own heavy palache, a straight, unforgiving blade meant to be driven home with the full weight of a man and a galloping horse. They practice endlessly, drills in the morning mist, honing the movements that have been passed down for generations. The lunge, the parry, the sweeping cut. They imagine themselves as knights of old, a tide of steel and courage that will sweep the enemy from the field. In their minds, war is an art, a violent but noble art, a matter of spirit, of elan, the will to close with the enemy and destroy him face to face. How could a machine, a simple mechanical contraption, possibly stand against such spirit? How could it stand against 1,000 men, 1,000 horses, 1,000 years of doctrine? This wasn't just confidence. It was an article of faith, a faith held not just by the young lieutenants, but by the old generals with their maps and their waxed mustaches. They saw the machine gun, they saw the new artillery, but they did not truly understand it. They saw it as a defensive tool, something to be overcome by sufficient bravery, a nuisance. So they sent the cavalry out. In the opening weeks of the Great War, the horsemen rode forth as they always had. They were the eyes and ears of the army, scouting ahead, screening the flanks, and they were looking for that one perfect moment. The moment when the enemy infantry would be caught in the open, disorganized, vulnerable, the moment for the charge. And then they found it, or rather it found them. Close your eyes and picture a field in northern France, a gentle slope of green, dotted with wildflowers. The sun is warm, the air is still. On one side of this field is a line of men in gray. They are not standing in neat ranks. They are lying down, lying in a shallow trench, a hastily scraped line in the earth. And among them, every 100 yards or so, sits a strange, spidery-looking thing on a tripod, the Maxim gun. From the woods at the other end of the field, the bugle sounds. It is a clear, piercing call that has stirred the hearts of soldiers for centuries. It means one thing: charge. And they come. First a few, then a dozen, then 100. A whole regiment of French dragoons, their horsehair plumes streaming from their polished steel helmets. They emerge from the trees in perfect formation, a beautiful, terrifying sight. The ground begins to tremble. The drumming of 1,000 hooves grows from a murmur to a rumble to a roar. The officers are out front, their sabers drawn, the steel a flash of silver against the blue of their coats. For the men in the trench, this is the very image of war they were taught to fear, a force of nature, an unstoppable wave of flesh and steel. For a moment, there must have been a flicker of doubt, a cold knot of terror in their stomachs. But they have the machine, the order is given, and the world changes. The air, once filled with the thunder of hooves, is torn apart by a new sound, a frantic, mechanical chatter, a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of cosmic canvas. It is a flat, impersonal, and utterly relentless sound. It does not get tired. It does not feel fear. It does not admire the bravery of its enemy. It simply works. The first line of horsemen seems to disintegrate. It is not a noble fight. They do not cross swords. They do not even get close. One moment, a man and his horse are a single powerful entity, a spear of living force. The next, they are a broken, falling heap of rags and bone. The bullets don't just kill, they shred. They tear through man and animal without distinction. A horse, its legs scythed from under it, tumbles forward, crushing its rider. A man, his chest open to the sky, is thrown from the saddle, his saber flying from his lifeless hand to spin uselessly in the grass. The charge falters. The perfect lines become a chaotic, screaming mob. Horses rear and panic, their eyes wide with terror. Riders try to control them, try to push forward into the storm of lead, but it is impossible. It is like trying to charge into a hurricane. The beautiful wave of steel has broken against an invisible wall, a wall of flying metal. The bugle sounds again. This time, it is the retreat. The survivors, what few there are, turn and flee back towards the woods, leaving the green field covered in the dead and the dying. The chattering of the machine gun slows and then stops. And a new silence falls, a modern silence, the silence of industrial-scale death. There is no honor in this silence, only the whimpering of wounded men and the terrible, high-pitched screams of maimed horses. The wildflowers are spattered with red. The swords of the fallen lie in the grass, their polished steel reflecting a sky that has grown cold and indifferent. This scene was repeated again and again in the opening months of the war. On the fields of Belgium, France, and Poland, British, French, German, Austrian, Russian cavalry all learned the same brutal lesson. Their faith was broken. The art of the charge was dead. The god they had worshipped, the god of Elan and cold steel, had been slain by a spitting machine. And get this, even after witnessing such horrors, some commanders refused to believe it. They blamed the terrain, they blamed the timing, they blamed the spirit of the men. They could not, or would not, accept that the entire philosophy of warfare, their entire way of life, had been rendered obsolete overnight, so they tried again. At the Battle of Moriah Wood in 1918, near the very end of the war, Canadian cavalry were ordered to charge German machine gun positions. It was a desperate, chaotic affair. They galloped through the shattered trees, leaping over trenches. Their 1908 patterned swords held out like lances. It was one of the last great charges of the war, and it was a bloodbath. They took the objective for a time, but the cost was staggering. Brigadier General Alfred Flowerdew, who led the charge, was killed, posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his suicidal bravery. His sword and the swords of his men did find their targets that day. There was close, brutal, hand-to-hand fighting in the woods, but it was a flicker, a final, convulsive spasm of a dying age. The sword worked, yes, but only after the machine gun had taken its terrible toll. It was a victory measured in yards, paid for with the best and the bravest, and it changed nothing. The war would be won not by cavalry charges, but by artillery, by attrition, and by the slow, grinding hell of the trenches. And what of the sword in that new world? The world of mud and wire and gas. It was still there, but it was a ghost, an anachronism. Officers still wore them, but often left them behind when going over the top. A long, clattering sword is a terrible encumbrance in the tight confines of a trench. It catches on everything. It gets in the way. Instead, soldiers turned to more primitive, more practical tools for the vicious, intimate fighting of a trench raid. They used sharpened shovels. They used clubs, studded with nails and bolts, brutal things they called trench sweepers. They used knives. And they used the bayonet. The bayonet was the true successor to the sword in this new war. A simple, ugly spike of steel fixed to the end of a rifle. It had none of the sword's grace, none of its history. But in the mud and the dark, it was brutally effective. The sword became a thing of the past, even as it was still being worn. A symbol of a cleaner, more noble war that no one was fighting anymore. To carry a sword into a trench was to carry a memory of a world that had vanished in a cloud of poison gas and the shriek of an artillery shell. You can almost feel the weight of that realization. Imagine being a young officer, trained your whole life in the art of swordsmanship, only to find yourself in a muddy ditch where your greatest weapon is a pistol, a grenade, or a sharpened spade. Your sword, the symbol of your authority and your heritage, is a useless piece of decorative metal. It is a lie. The lie of glorious war. The war ended. The humming of the great forges of industry fell silent. For a time, the men who survived came home, and they hung their swords over the fireplace. They were cleaned, one last time. The rust and the mud of the trenches wiped away. The small nicks from a final, desperate parry polished over. And there it stayed. It was no longer a weapon. It was an artifact, a souvenir from hell. It was a reminder of a promise that had been broken. The promise of glory. The promise of a swift victory. A reminder of friends who rode into a storm of steel and simply vanished. The sword's long, bloody reign on the battlefield was over. For 3,000 years, it had been the apex predator, the symbol of power, the decider of battles, the arbiter of life and death. It had carved empires and ended dynasties. It had been wielded by heroes and tyrants. It had been given names, and it had been worshipped. And it was all ended by a quiet, unassuming engineer named Hiram Maxim, who figured out how to use the recoil of a single shot to load and fire the next one. That simple, ingenious idea was the death of the sword. The death of the knight, the death of the cavalry charge. The story does not end there, of course. The sword does not simply vanish. It transforms. It retreats from the battlefield and enters the realm of myth. It becomes a ceremonial object, a dress uniform accessory, a collector's item. It appears in our fantasy stories, in our movies, in our video games. It represents a more elegant, more personal, more honorable form of combat. A fantasy, a beautiful, dangerous fantasy that ignores the mud, the blood, and the screaming. The sword on the wall is silent. It does not speak of the terror of the charge or the sickening feeling of a blade sinking into flesh. It speaks only of a quiet, dignified past, a past that never truly existed. Its work is done. The long, slow arc of its history, from the first bronze daggers in the ancient world to the last, desperate cavalry charge in a shattered French wood, has reached its conclusion. The blade is cold now. It will not be warmed again by the heat of the forge or the heat of battle. It will only gather dust and reflect the fading light of a world that has moved on, a world that found a way to kill that was faster, more efficient, and infinitely more terrible. A world that no longer had any use for the simple, brutal elegance of a sharpened piece of steel. The final silence of the sword is not the silence of the battlefield after the fighting is done. It is the silence of a museum, the silence of a forgotten corner of an attic. It is the quiet, contemplative piece of an object whose purpose has been lost to time. Its story is now just that, a story, a dark and fascinating and deeply human story, a story of art and of violence, of honor and of slaughter, a story that is now, finally, at its end. Or perhaps it is simply waiting in the quiet for a hand that will never again draw it in anger. But a blade does not always wait for a hand of honor. It does not always rest in velvet, dreaming of forgotten duels under a pale moon. Sometimes it waits in the dark, damp earth of a shed, caked in mud and rust, not a sword of legend, but its crude and brutal cousin, the machete, the panga, the tool of the harvest. It waits not for glory, but for an order, for a voice on the radio, for a signal that the time for reaping has come, but not for the sugarcane, not for the banana plant. The world likes to believe it has moved on from the blade. We have missiles that can cross continents, drones that see from the heavens. We have weapons of such sophisticated, impersonal lethality that the idea of a sharpened piece of steel seems almost quaint, an artifact, a relic of a more barbaric time. We tell ourselves that we have evolved beyond such things, that the cold, intimate horror of the blade belongs to the past, but it does not. The blade has never left us. It has only changed its shape and waited for us to forget the fear it commands. To understand this, you cannot look in a museum. You have to go to a place of breathtaking beauty, a land of 1,000 hills, green and rolling under an immense African sky. Rwanda, in the spring of 1994. Before the horror, you would have seen the blade everywhere, in the hands of farmers clearing brush, in the hands of workers cutting paths through the jungle. It was a part of the landscape, as common as the earth itself. A simple, practical tool, no different than a shovel or a hoe. You would not have given it a second thought. And that was its power, its ubiquity, its terrifying normalcy. When the signal was given, when the hate that had been simmering for generations was finally uncorked by voices crackling over the radio, the killing began. And it was not done with the detached efficiency of modern warfare. It was done with the blade. It was done with the machete. Close your eyes and listen, not to my voice, but to the sound of that time. It is not the boom of artillery. It is not the crack of a rifle. It is something much older, much more personal. It is the sound of sharpening steel on stone, a rhythmic, scraping sound echoing through the villages. It is the sound of thousands of men, neighbors, picking up the tools they used to tend their fields and turning them on the people they lived beside. The Rwandan genocide was not a war in the conventional sense. It was a slaughter, an extermination, and its primary instrument was the blade. Why? Because a bullet is quick, and in some ways, mercifully distant. A gun creates a space between the killer and the killed. But a blade is intimate. It requires strength. It requires proximity. You have to look into the eyes of the person whose life you are taking. You have to feel the resistance, the warmth. It is an act of gruesome physical effort. It is work. And the perpetrators of this genocide spoke of it as such. They called it clearing the brush. They spoke of cutting the tall trees. The blade transformed the very air. The simple act of a neighbor walking down the road, carrying a machete as he had every day of his life, suddenly became a moment of pure, heart-stopping terror. Is he going to the fields? Or is he coming for my family? The familiar became monstrous. The everyday became the executioner's tool. For 100 days the blades fell. In churches, in schools, in homes. The United Nations was there, but they were ordered not to intervene. The world watched, but it did not act. And in that vacuum of conscience, the blade did its work. It was efficient in its own horrific way. It was cheap. It was available everywhere. And it was, above all, terrifying. It returned humanity to a primal state of fear, the fear of the sharpened edge, the fear of the strong arm wielding it. Imagine the last moments, not the clean, cinematic death of a movie, but the brutal, clumsy reality of it, the smell of sweat and fear, the sound of pleading, and then the shocking, final weight of the blow. This was repeated hundreds of thousands of times, over and over again, until the rivers ran red and the green hills were littered with the dead. The blade, in its most basic form, had shown the modern world that it had lost none of its power. It had simply been waiting. The chilling thing is how the blade story didn't end in the fields of Rwanda. The terror it could inspire was not a lesson that was forgotten. It simply found a new stage, a new audience, and a new, colder purpose. Before we walk onto that stage, a brief moment. If you are finding these dark histories help you find your own quiet, your own rest, consider subscribing to The Dark Historian. It is a small, simple act that allows these stories to continue. Now, let the world fade once more. Let us return to the story of the blade. The new stage was not a battlefield. It was a screen. Your screen. A laptop screen, a phone screen. The audience was not a terrified village, but the entire world, connected by the internet. And the purpose was not conquest, or even extermination. It was propaganda. It was the theater of terror. In the early 21st century, as extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and later ISIS rose in the Middle East, they understood something profound about the Western psyche. We had become desensitized. We saw bombings on the news. We saw firefights. It was tragic, but it was distant. It was the familiar wallpaper of modern conflict. To truly command attention, to truly inspire fear, they needed something else. They needed to break through the noise, and so they reached back in time. Past the rifle, past the bomb, past the drone, they reached for the blade. You have seen the images, even if you have tried to look away, a kneeling figure in an orange jumpsuit, a stark and deliberate reference to prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. Behind them, a figure clad in black, face hidden, and in their hand, a knife. Not a sword of ancient glory, but a simple, modern combat knife. The setting is a barren desert, the sky a flat, empty canvas. It is a scene stripped of all context except for the three elements: the victim, the executioner, and the blade. The act that follows is not meant for the victim. Their fate is already sealed. It is meant for you. It is a performance, a carefully staged message. The use of a blade is a deliberate choice. A beheading is one of humanity's oldest and most feared forms of execution. It speaks to a primal part of our brain that understands the fragility of the neck, the seat of our voice, our breath, our identity. It is the ultimate act of domination and dehumanization. A gunshot is loud, chaotic, and over in an instant. A beheading is quiet, deliberate, and slow. It forces the viewer to watch. It is unsparing in its intimacy. The grainy, low-resolution video, far from diminishing the horror, actually enhances it. It feels raw, illicit, real. It bypasses the polished sheen of mainstream news and feels like you are witnessing something you were never meant to see. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. These groups knew that these videos would spread like wildfire across the internet. They knew that news organizations would debate whether to show them, a debate that in itself amplified their message. They knew they could instill a level of fear and revulsion that a car bomb in a distant market never could. They were hijacking our own technology to deliver a medieval horror directly into our homes. The blade became their brand, their symbol, a stand-in for their entire ideology: brutal, uncompromising, and a rejection of the modern world's rules of engagement. And they were not alone. Thousands of miles away, in the sun-scorched landscapes of Mexico, the drug cartels were learning the same lesson. In their brutal wars for territory and power, they too turned to the blade as a tool of communication. When they wanted to send a message to a rival gang, to the police, to a journalist who got too close, they didn't just use a bullet. That was too easy. too forgettable. They used machetes and knives. They recorded their acts of torture and execution. They dismembered bodies and left them in public places with crudely written signs or narcomantas explaining the reason for the killing. This wasn't just murder, it was a form of public relations. It was advertising, an advertisement for their own ruthlessness. Like the extremists in the Middle East, the cartels understood that the blade communicates in a language that transcends words. It speaks of absolute power. It tells rivals we are not bound by any law. We are not afraid of any authority. We can do this to you. This is how little your life means to us. It tells the public, do not cross us. Do not speak out. This is what happens to those who do. The horror is not just in the act itself, but in its cold, calculated purpose. The person wielding the blade is not in a fit of rage. They are, in their own terrible way, a messenger. The blade is their pen. The victim's body is their canvas, and the message is pure, unadulterated fear. A fear designed to paralyze communities, to silence opposition, to ensure that their reign of terror can continue unchallenged. What does this tell us? It tells us that the sword, the blade, has completed a strange and terrible circle. It began as a tool of survival, then became a weapon of conquest and a symbol of justice and nobility. It was rendered obsolete on the battlefield by the gun, and we placed it in our museums, believing its story was over. But we were wrong. It has returned, not as a soldier's weapon, but as a terrorist's tool. It has been stripped of all its chivalry, all its romance, all its artistry. All that is left is the edge. All that is left is the fear. It has found a new kind of power not on the field of battle, but in the battle for our minds. Its modern legacy is not written in the annals of warfare, but in the dark corners of the internet, in the nightmares of those who have seen its work, and in the silence of those who are too afraid to speak. The blade proves that technology does not erase our primal nature. It only provides new ways to express it. Even in an age of cyber warfare and atomic weapons, the most effective way to terrorize a human being is still the oldest way. A sharpened piece of steel, a steady hand, and the willingness to commit an act of intimate, unspeakable violence. The sword in the museum case seems so silent now, so harmless, but its shadow is long, and in that shadow, new blades are being sharpened, not for duels of honor, but for acts of terror, not to defend a kingdom, but to broadcast a threat. The blade is no longer a kingmaker. It is a fear-maker, and its chilling whisper has not been silenced by the roar of the modern world. It has only learned to speak a new and more terrifying language. It reminds us that the line between civilization and barbarism is never as clear as we would like to think, and that sometimes all it takes to cross it is the simple, terrible decision to pick up a blade. And so we are left with that single, terrifying choice. The decision to lift a piece of sharpened metal and change the world with it. To end a life, to defend one, to carve a nation out of the earth, or to raise a city to the ground. For thousands of years, that was the fulcrum on which so much of human history turned. But where are those choices now? Where do those terrible, world-shaping instruments rest? To find them, you have to go somewhere quiet, somewhere still, a place where the air is cool and filtered, where voices are kept to a respectful hush. You have to go to a museum. Picture it. You are walking through a long, dimly lit hall. Your footsteps make no sound on the polished floor. To your left and right, behind thick panes of climate-controlled glass, the history we have just walked through lies sleeping. It is arranged by time period, by culture, by dynasty. It is clean. It is ordered. It is safe. And there, in the center of a display, is a sword. Perhaps it is a Viking blade, dredged from the cold mud of a riverbed. Its surface is pitted and dark, but the line of it, the simple, brutal honesty of its shape, is still there. It lies on a bed of soft, dark velvet. A small, neatly printed card next to it gives you a date, a location, maybe a name. 9th century Norse longsword. The light catches what remains of the edge. It is a dull gray now, of course, harmless, an artifact, a piece of archaeology. It is beautiful in a stark, menacing way. You can admire the craftsmanship, the balance it must have once had. You can appreciate it as an object, a relic of a lost time. But the museum, in its quest to preserve, has performed a strange kind of magic. It has sanitized the story. It has scrubbed away the truth of the thing. The label does not tell you about the smell of the salt spray and wet wool on the longship that carried it. It does not speak of the gnawing hunger in the belly of the man who owned it, the desperation that drove him from his rocky home to seek plunder in a foreign land. It does not describe the jarring, bone-shaking shock that ran up his arm the first time the blade struck a shield. The splintering of wood, the grunt of effort. It does not, and cannot, convey the sound it made. Not the elegant **shing* you hear in films, but the wet, heavy, sickening *thump* as it bit into flesh and bone. The label does not tell you about the screams, or the gurgling sound a man makes with a pierced lung. It doesn't tell you about the blood. Not the bright, cinematic red, but the dark, sticky, hot reality of it, soaking into the dirt and freezing in the cold air. The man who wielded that sword did not think of it as an artifact. It was not a piece of history to him. It was a tool. It was an extension of his will. It was his shield and his terror, his provider and his damnation. When he looked at it, he didn't see an object for a display case. He saw the faces of the men he had killed. He felt the phantom ache in his shoulder from 1,000 practice swings. He remembered the cold dread before a battle and the manic, screaming elation after it. All of that is gone now, washed away by time and the careful hands of a curator. The sword is sleeping. It has been sheathed, not in leather or wood, but in a sheath of academic reverence. It has been made silent. You move on, down the hall. Another case, this one lit more brightly. Inside, a katana rests on 2 small, elegant stands. Its curve is perfect, a line of impossible grace. The steel has been polished to a mirror finish, and you can see the hamon, the temper line, like a ghostly wave or a distant mountain range along the cutting edge. The guard, the tsuba, is a small work of art in itself, a miniature sculpture of a dragon or a crane. This is not just a weapon, it is a piece of art, the embodiment of a philosophy, the soul of the samurai. That is what the stories tell us. That is what the presentation suggests. Honor, discipline, precision, a higher purpose. But this too is a beautiful lie, or at least, a beautiful half-truth. The soul of this sword is not just in the zen-like focus of the smith who folded its steel 1,000 times. Its soul is also in the cold purpose for which it was made. This blade was designed to do one thing with terrifying efficiency: to cut through a human body. The label won't tell you about the practice of tame-shijiri, where swords like this were tested on the bodies of condemned criminals, or sometimes on corpses. It won't describe the chilling precision of an execution, the single, silent draw and cut in a quiet courtyard. It won't tell you about the peasant who failed to show the proper respect and was cut down where he stood, a demonstration of the samurai's absolute authority. The beautiful, wave-like pattern on the steel was designed to create a harder, more resilient edge, an edge that would not chip when it struck bone. The elegant curve was not just for aesthetics. It was engineered to make slicing cuts more effective, to allow the blade to draw through its target with minimal resistance. Every single element of its celebrated beauty is a direct consequence of its lethal function. It is a masterpiece of deadly engineering, presented to us as a masterpiece of art. We admire the form and conveniently forget the function. We see the honor and ignore the horror. The blade is silent. It does not whisper of the last breaths it witnessed, of the lives it bisected in a flash of silver light. It just lies there, serene, perfect. And in its perfection, it is a far more effective liar than the pitted Viking blade. It convinces you of its nobility. This is what we do with our monsters once they can no longer harm us. We either lock them away, or we dress them up and put them on display. We romanticize them. The sword has become a fantasy. It is the sword in the stone, the symbol of rightful kingship. It is the lightsaber, an elegant weapon for a more civilized age. It is the hero's companion, the badge of honor. We so easily forget that for the vast majority of human history, the sword was not a fantasy. It was a dreadful, tangible reality. It was the reason a village might be burned to the ground. It was the tool of the tax collector, the enforcer, the tyrant. It was the source of the deepest of all fears, the fear of a sudden, violent, and painful death. You continue your slow, quiet walk through the museum. You pass a case of rapiers, slender, needle-like blades with intricate, basket-like hilts. They speak of an age of elegance, of Renaissance courts, of duels fought for honor. The word duel itself sounds so clean, so civilized, a structured contest between two equals. But the reality was a frantic, desperate scramble for life. A duel was not a dance. It was a flurry of steel in a muddy field at dawn, the air misty and cold. The men fighting were often not stoic masters, but terrified youths, their hands slick with sweat, their hearts hammering against their ribs. And the wounds a rapier wound was not a clean cut. It was a puncture, a deep, narrow hole that led an infection. A pierced lung would mean a slow, gurgling death over hours or days. A stomach wound would mean the agony of peritonitis. There was very little honor in dying of a fever, delirious and writhing in a sweat-soaked bed a week after the fight. The rapier in the glass case doesn't tell you that. It speaks only of gallantry, of a misplaced notion of honor that cost countless lives over trifles. The sanitization is complete. The sword has been neutered. It has been transformed from a tool of brutal, intimate violence into a symbol. It hangs on the walls of castles, crossed over fireplaces. It's used in logos for security companies. It's a prop in a school play. It has become safe. And in becoming safe, it allows us to look back on the eras it dominated with a strange sense of nostalgia. We imagine ourselves as the knight in shining armor, not the peasant he cut down. We see ourselves as the noble duelist, not the man bleeding out in the mud. History becomes a story, a grand adventure, and we are always the heroes. The museum helps us with this story. It presents the evidence, but it strips it of its context of pain. It gives us the beauty of the object without the ugliness of its purpose. It shows us the weapon, but it hides the wound. Think of the sheer, staggering human cost represented in this single hall. Every sword on display was born of conflict. Every one of them was designed to kill, and many, if not most of them, did. For every blade sleeping under the soft lights, there is a ghost, a legion of ghosts. The men, women, and children whose lives were ended by a similar piece of steel. Their stories are not on the labels. Their names are lost. All that is left is the instrument of their death, now admired for its craftsmanship. Is there something wrong with this? Perhaps not. We cannot live our lives constantly dwelling on the horrors of the past. We must move on. We must find beauty where we can. And there is an undeniable, captivating beauty in a well-made sword. It represents the pinnacle of a craftsman's skill, a mastery of fire and metal that is, in itself, an incredible human achievement. But as you stand there, in the silence of the museum, it is worth remembering the truth. It is worth taking a moment to look past the polish and the artistry and to acknowledge the blade's true nature. This is not just history, it is a record of violence. This is not just art. It is a weapon, designed with care and skill to tear through human flesh. This is not just a symbol of honor. It is a monument to our species' enduring capacity for conflict, for cruelty, for solving our problems with sharpened steel. The sword story is a dark one. It is a story written in blood and fear. It is the story of the forge and the anvil, but also of the battlefield and the scream. It's the story of empires built and empires fallen, of ideologies enforced at the point of a blade, of countless, forgotten individuals whose last sight on this earth was a glint of polished metal swinging towards them. And now it is quiet. The forges are cold. The armies march to the sound of engines, not the rasp of a sword leaving its scabbard. The age of the blade is over. It has passed from the world of the warrior into the world of the historian, the collector, the curator. Its voice is gone. Its song is silenced. All we have left is the echo. As you turn to leave the hall, you might catch your own reflection in the glass of the display case. For a fleeting moment, your face is superimposed over the ancient blade. The modern and the archaic, the living and the dead, the world of peace and the world of war, all occupying the same space. It is a reminder that the history of this object is your history. It is our history. The same impulses that led one person to forge it and another to wield it still exist within us. The capacity for creation and destruction, for love and for hate, for peace and for violence. The sword may be sheathed in the museum, its physical threat gone, but the ideas it represents, the part of the human spirit it speaks to, are never truly put behind glass. They are never truly safe. And so, the story ends not with a bang, but with a whisper, the whisper of a blade resting on velvet, the whisper of 1,000 forgotten voices, the quiet, contemplative silence of a history that has been put to sleep, but one that never truly dies. Let that silence fill the room around you now. Let the darkness be a comfort. The long story of the sword is over. Its journey through fire and blood has come to an end here, in this quiet place, and now you too can rest. There are no more battles to fight, no more edges to sharpen. There is only the stillness of the night, the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. In and out, the museum is closing, the lights are dimming one by one. The ghosts of the past are settling down for the night, and all is quiet. All is still. Sleep now.